Hello everyone, I am the Creep's Cabin. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from? And what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I had been traveling solo around the Olympic Peninsula for a few days, stopping at different parts of Olympic National Park whenever I felt like it. It was the off-season, so I rarely saw other people. The air had that crisp autumn feel, but the sun had been beating down unusually hard for mid-fall, making it warmer than I expected. I wasn't in any rush. My plan was loose, just to explore and see where the road took me. That's how I ended up in Quinault for the first time. I had driven past the lake and into the forest, following a road I had never taken before, until it eventually dead-ended at a stunningly beautiful spot right on the edge of the Quinault River. The water was calm, reflecting the sky like a mirror. Across the river, towering evergreens framed the landscape, making it feel like I had stumbled into a hidden world. There was no one else around. No parked cars. No signs of foot traffic. Nothing but the sound of the water and the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. An old footbridge stretched across the river, connecting my side to the other. It looked ancient, weathered wood and sagging ropes barely holding it together. The planks were warped and uneven, some missing entirely. It was clear that no one had used it in years. I briefly considered trying to cross it, just for the adventure, but one look at the way it swayed in the breeze told me I'd be risking my life. I wasn't in the mood to test fate that way. I stayed in my car for a little while, just taking it all in. The drive had been long, and the warm air made me feel heavy with exhaustion. My windows were rolled down, and the scent of damp earth and pine was thick in the air. The river looked too inviting. It wasn't just the heat, it was something else. An urge, a need to be in that water. I backed my car up as far as I could, making sure it was facing the way I needed to leave. I had been in enough isolated places before to know that setting yourself up for a quick exit was always a good idea. I turned off the engine, pocketed my keys, and started making my way through the thick brush toward the riverbank. There was no path. The terrain was rugged, overgrown with blackberry vines and fallen branches. I had to push my way through, stepping carefully over uneven ground as I made my descent toward the water. The embankment was steep in some places, forcing me to crouch and grip onto tree roots for balance. The sound of the river grew louder the closer I got, and when I finally broke through the last bit of brush, I was right at the edge of the water. The river was cold, but I didn't care. I hadn't brought a swimsuit, hadn't planned on swimming at all, but it didn't matter. I stripped down to my bra and underwear, leaving my clothes and shoes in a pile a few feet from the shore. Then, without hesitating, I stepped in. The shock of the cold made me gasp, but within seconds, it felt perfect. I let myself float, letting the water carry me. I could see the sky above, the tops of trees swaying gently. The only sounds were the soft lapping of the water against the shore and the occasional bird call in the distance. But then something changed. At first, it was just a feeling, a shift in the atmosphere, that deep, instinctual sense that something wasn't right. I felt watched. I told myself I was being paranoid. I was alone in the middle of nowhere, half naked in a river. It made sense that I'd feel vulnerable. But no matter how much I tried to shake it off, the feeling only grew stronger. It was like a weight pressing on my chest. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. My stomach twisted. I turned my head slightly, scanning the tree line, the footbridge, the opposite shore. Nothing. Still, I couldn't ignore it. The unease was too strong. I decided I'd had enough. 5 minutes in the water was plenty. I waded back toward the shore, climbing up the embankment to where I had left my clothes. The moment my feet hit dry land, I turned my back to the river, reaching down to grab my things. My fingers brushed against my jeans, and then I froze. Something was there. I didn't hear footsteps. No branches snapping. No rustling in the bushes. But when I turned around, he was just there. A man, standing directly across from me on the other side of the river, higher up on his embankment, completely still. He was tall, taller than any man I had ever seen, with broad shoulders and a wiry, lean build. His hair was long, tangled, full of twigs and leaves like he had been rolling in the forest floor. He wore a poncho made of animal pelts, ragged and filthy. His skin was darkened with dirt, his feet bare. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. We stared at each other. His eyes were locked onto mine, unblinking. His expression was unreadable, neither curious nor angry nor afraid. Just blank. Seconds stretched into what felt like hours. My pulse was so loud in my ears I could barely hear anything else. Then suddenly, he moved. Not away, not back into the trees, toward the bridge. He took off in a frantic sprint, his bare feet slapping against the ground as he ran toward the footbridge. Toward me. My body reacted before my brain did. I grabbed my car key, tried to snatch up my clothes and shoes, but they got tangled in the blackberry vines. I tugged once, twice, then gave up. It didn't matter. I ran, barefoot, barely dressed, tearing through the thick brush without a second thought. The blackberries ripped at my legs, my arms. Branches clawed at my skin. My feet slammed against rocks and roots, but I didn't stop. I could hear him. The creaking of the bridge, the thudding of footsteps, the sound of someone coming for me. I broke free of the brush just as he reached the end of the bridge. My car. It was right there. I lunged for the door, yanking it open so hard I thought the handle might snap off. I threw myself inside and slammed the lock down just as he reached me. The impact rattled the car. He slammed both hands onto the hood, his face contorted in a silent, furious scream. His mouth opened wide, but no words came out, just a raw, guttural sound. He pounded his fists, his body jerking in violent spasms, like something inside him was trying to tear its way out. Then he lunged for the driver's side door. I hit the gas. The tires spun against the dirt for a second before they caught traction. The car lurched forward, the force slamming me back against the seat. In the rearview mirror, I saw him. He was running, chasing me, barefoot, nearly keeping pace with the car, his body moving in an unnatural, frantic way. His arms pumped, his mouth still open in that horrible, soundless scream. He kept up for almost a mile before he finally faded from view. I didn't stop driving. Not when I hit the main road. Not when I reached the highway. I didn't stop until I was back in a town, surrounded by people, light safety. Only then did I pull over. I was shaking, bleeding. My skin was raw from the blackberries. I was still wet, half naked, gasping for air. I don't remember crying, but I must have, because when I finally looked at myself in the mirror, my face was streaked with tears. I never went back. I never will. Even now, years later, I still see him when I close my eyes. That moment will haunt me for the rest of my life. I woke up to the sound of water moving, a deep, steady lapping against the shore. It wasn't the wind, it was too rhythmic. Something big was moving through the water. I was in my tent, wrapped in my sleeping bag, body stiff from the cold morning air. The first thing I did was listen. I cracked open one eye and looked at the mesh window, but it was still pitch black outside. Early morning, probably somewhere between 3 and 5 a.m. Another splash. Not a fish, not a beaver, not a moose. This was bigger, heavier. The water rolled in response, sending small waves lapping onto the shore. I knew that sound. A bear. The realization hit like a rock in my gut. I felt my body tense up, every muscle awake now, heart starting to hammer in my chest. I listened hard, trying to figure out how close it was. If it was still in the water, I had time. Bears don't like surprises, and the last thing I wanted was to startle it. Then I heard the sound of wet fur shaking. That deep, heavy exhale, followed by the spray of water as it shook itself dry. It was on land. I forced myself to breathe slow. Stay calm. Don't make a sound. The air inside my tent felt thick, suffocating. Every instinct screamed to get up, to run, but I knew better. Then the sniffing started. A deep, steady inhale, followed by another. It was searching, scenting the air, trying to figure out what was nearby. My food was packed away properly, stashed in a bear-resistant container far from my tent. But that didn't mean I was safe. I reached slowly for my bear spray. My fingers found the canister, grip tightening around it. Then silence. No sniffing. No movement. Just the sound of the wind in the trees and the water lapping against the shore. Had it left? I stayed still, waiting, straining my ears. A minute passed. Then another. My muscles started to ache from the tension. I slowly exhaled, trying to relax. Maybe it had just passed through, lost interest. Then a heavy huff right outside my tent. It was still here. Later that week, I was deep in the park, hiking to a remote survey site. The trail was narrow, winding through thick brush, the kind of terrain that made you feel small. The kind of place where you could walk right past an animal and never know it was there. The wind was light, enough to move the trees, but not enough to mask sound. I focused on my steps, keeping a steady pace. Then I heard it, a deep sniff behind me. Not the wind, not an echo. I stopped. The air around me felt electric, my skin crawling with the certainty that I was being watched. Slowly, carefully, I turned my head. 15 meters away, standing right in the middle of my trail, was a sow, and behind her a cub. My stomach dropped. I locked eyes with the bear for a split second before looking away, keeping my posture low, non-threatening. The sow had followed my scent. Maybe she'd been curious. Maybe she was just making sure I wasn't a threat. Either way, she had her cub with her, and that meant danger. I kept still, barely breathing. She sniffed the air again, ears twitching forward, eyes locked onto me. My bear spray was in my hand now, thumb on the safety. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then, without a sound, she turned. Just like that. She huffed, exhaled hard through her nose, then nudged her cub and walked back into the brush. I stood there, frozen, heart pounding. Only after she was gone did I realize I'd been holding my breath. Days later, at another campsite, I ran into a different problem. I had boated past a moose carcass earlier in the day, half-eaten, picked apart by scavengers. That night, just as I was settling into camp, I heard something moving beyond the tree line. Not a bear. The sound was lower to the ground, more erratic. A boar, wounded, angry. It had probably been feeding on that moose carcass, and now it was here. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the trees. The light caught movement, dark, thick muscle shifting between the trunks. Then it stepped into the open, scarred. One tusk chipped, the other stained red. Its body was thick, powerful. Wounded, but still dangerous. I grabbed a rock and threw it. Hard. It smacked against the ground near the boar's feet. Nothing. I yelled, waving my arms. It took a step back. Then it came forward again. I grabbed another rock, threw it harder. It flinched, turned, then stopped, then turned back toward me. Again, and again. Each time it left. Each time it came right back. The worst weather I'd ever seen came in the form of a willowaw. I was holed up in a plywood cabin, stuck for 48 hours as the wind screamed through the valley. It hit in waves, smashing into the walls, shaking the entire structure. Loose pumice, sharp, volcanic rock, slammed against the walls, scouring the wood like sandpaper. I felt every gust, every impact. I barely slept. Each gust felt like it might be the one that tore the cabin apart. Later, I had to cross a glacial river with a full pack. The water was ice cold, fast moving. My pack weighed 50 pounds. One misstep, and I'd be gone. I moved slow, testing each step. My legs burned from the cold. My boots scraped against unseen rocks, the current trying to pull me down. Every second felt like a fight. When I finally made it across, I collapsed onto the shore, gasping for breath, fingers numb from the cold. But none of it compared to the moment the engine cut out. We were flying over the park, a single-engine plane, heading back from a remote survey. Below us, nothing but forest, mountains, and rivers. Then the engine sputtered, coughed, then went silent. For a moment, there was nothing but the rush of wind. The pilot swore under his breath. He reached for the fuel gauge. Empty. I felt my stomach drop. The plane dipped. The trees below seemed to rise toward us. The pilot worked fast, flipping switches, adjusting the controls. The wind screamed past the windows. Then, with a deep chug, the engine roared back to life. The plane leveled out. The ground stopped rushing toward us. I sat back, heart pounding. We didn't speak. We didn't have to. The park had tried to kill me before. It would try again. We had been on the road for nearly 10 hours, winding our way through Wyoming's open stretches and the towering peaks of the Teton Range before finally pulling into Coulter Bay Campground. It was one of those places you see in National Geographic. Pristine, almost too perfect, nestled right against Jackson Lake with its deep blue water stretching to the base of the mountains. Even in the dark, we could tell we had picked a hell of a spot. Remote, quiet. Exactly what we were looking for. The three of us, me, Jake, and Tyler, had spent the day hiking Cascade Canyon, taking in the views, letting the altitude hit us just right. By the time we got back to camp, our legs were heavy, and the chill of the mountain air had settled in. We cooked up a quick dinner over the camp stove, mostly sitting in tired silence, letting the crackling of the fire and the occasional hoot of an owl fill the gaps in conversation. Coulter Bay is a big campground, but we were set up in one of the farthest back sites, right where the trees start pressing in tight, and the sound of the lake becomes a distant whisper. We didn't have any campers around us, no tents next door, no RVs humming in the distance. Just empty sites and the deep woods beyond them. It was perfect during the day, but as the darkness thickened, it became something else entirely. The fire burned down to embers, and with the cold biting at us, we turned in for the night. The three of us squeezed into the tent, layering up against the chill, bear spray set within arm's reach, the hatchet lying beside the entrance just in case. It didn't take long before exhaustion took over. That's when I heard it. It started low, almost a growl, rising into a sound I still can't explain. A guttural, raw, violent scream. It cut through the night, ripping me from the edge of sleep. It wasn't close, not right outside the tent, but it was near enough to make my chest tighten, my breath catch. It was the sound of something killing, something fighting for its life. I stared into the darkness of the tent, the walls around me feeling suddenly paper thin. For a second, I thought I had imagined it, the product of a half-dream, until the sound came again, this time longer, more stretched out. A wet, awful sound, like something being torn apart. My body felt like it was made of stone. The sound wasn't a bear. I had heard black bears before, the deep-chested huffs, the moaning grumbles. This was something else. A cat, maybe. A mountain lion. Maybe a bobcat, but it sounded too big for that. My brain scrambled to make sense of it, to push it into a box that wouldn't set off the deep, primal part of me that screamed to run. I barely moved, barely breathed, just listening. The tent was silent except for the slow, steady breathing of Jake and Tyler. I wasn't sure if they were awake until I heard the smallest shift in a sleeping bag, the kind of movement you make when you don't want to move at all. A whisper barely left my lips. "You heard that, right?" The response came back just as low. "Yup." Tyler, from the other side. "Yup." And that was it. We didn't speak another word. Didn't try to guess what it was. Didn't say we should get up and check. We just laid there, stiff as corpses, hoping the sounds wouldn't get closer. The screaming went on for a few minutes, sometimes sharp, sometimes low and dragging. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Silence. I strained my ears, waiting for another sound. A snap of a branch, heavy footsteps, rustling in the undergrowth. Anything. But there was nothing. Just the weight of the night pressing in on us, thicker than before. We didn't sleep right away, but eventually exhaustion won. One by one, we drifted off, the fear never fully leaving. Dawn came slow. When I finally unzipped the tent and stepped out, the cold air bit at my face, waking me up faster than any cup of coffee could. Jake and Tyler followed, silent, their eyes still heavy from a night of half-sleep. The woods were still. The kind of stillness that comes after something violent has passed through. Birds weren't singing yet, the squirrels weren't chattering. Just the soft lapping of Jackson Lake in the distance. I stepped out farther, scanning the trees, looking for anything, tracks, blood, signs of a struggle. But the forest looked untouched, indifferent to whatever had happened the night before. We went about the morning like normal, cooking breakfast, packing up our gear for the day's hike. But none of us mentioned what we had heard. Not directly. It was only later, after we had returned from our hike, after the sun had started to dip behind the mountains, that Jake finally spoke up. "You think it was a mountain lion?" Tyler was crouched near the fire pit, poking at the embers. "Maybe." I shook my head. "Don't know. Whatever it was, I don't want to meet it." The thought settled over us. We still had 2 more nights at Coulter Bay. That second night, I lay awake for a long time listening. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the underbrush made my pulse spike. The wind carried sounds that made me second-guess myself. A distant coyote, an owl's hoot, the creak of the trees. But nothing came close. No screams. No guttural cries. It was almost worse that way, the silence thick with anticipation. By the last night, we had let our guard down, lulled into thinking that whatever had happened the first night was a one-time thing. Maybe we had just caught the tail end of some predator's kill, something that had since moved on. It was just past midnight when I heard it again. Not a scream this time. A deep, low growl. Closer than before. I didn't move, just listened. The sound came from the trees behind the campsite, somewhere in the dark, past where the firelight could reach. Not fast, not aggressive, just steady breathing, an exhale that felt too close. I knew then that whatever had made that noise the first night was still here. still watching. I didn't wake Jake or Tyler. Didn't make a sound. I just gripped the bear spray tighter and waited. I must have drifted off at some point because the next thing I knew, morning light was breaking through the tent walls. We packed up that day without much talking, leaving Coulter Bay behind. As we drove out of the park, I glanced back at the dense trees, the endless stretches of wilderness beyond them. Whatever had been out there that night, it had always been there. Long before us. Long after. We were just visitors. I never expected my life to turn out this way. I used to be someone else, someone with plans, someone with a future. I had a stable job, a family, a home. I had a purpose. Then, in the space of a single phone call, everything was taken from me. Now, I scrub floors in silence, lost in the hum of vacuum cleaners and the sharp scent of bleach. The people I clean for don't know who I used to be. They don't know what I lost. They just see a woman in an old uniform, tired looking, moving through hallways like a shadow. But I remember. I remember everything. It started with a dream, a fresh start. My husband and I had spent years talking about it, planning it. Spain. A new life, a better life. We were going to leave behind the cold, the gray skies, the long commutes, and the stress. We had a house waiting for us, a place with warm air, a sea breeze, and space for our daughter to grow up in the sunshine. I had a job lined up, something I had worked hard for, something stable. My husband had sorted everything out on his end, and we were finally ready. The plan was simple. He and our daughter would fly out first. They would settle in, unpack the furniture, get everything set up. I would follow shortly after, just a couple of weeks behind them. I needed to finish my last days at work, tie up loose ends. It wasn't ideal, but it was only a short separation. We had been through longer. I remember taking them to the airport. My daughter, small and sleepy, clutching her stuffed rabbit. My husband, full of energy, excited, checking and rechecking his passport and boarding passes. I hugged them both tightly. I kissed my daughter's hair, told her I would see her soon. She nodded, yawning, already distracted by something on the airport screens. My husband smiled, kissed me, told me not to worry. It would all be fine. It was the last time I ever saw them alive. The first day was fine. I went to work, came home, made dinner for one. I missed them, but it was manageable. I was too busy to dwell on it. That night, my husband called me. I remember his voice, warm, happy. He told me they had arrived safely. The house was perfect. The movers had delivered the furniture. Our daughter had been running through the rooms, laughing, picking which one she wanted. He said I would love it. I could picture it all in my head. It made me excited. A week or two more, and I would be there with them. It was the last time I ever heard his voice. The next day, there was nothing. No messages, no calls. I thought maybe they were just busy. A new country, so many things to sort out. I told myself not to be paranoid. My husband wasn't always the best at checking his phone. By the second day, I was restless. I sent messages. No reply. I called. No answer. It went straight to voicemail. I told myself it was fine. Maybe they hadn't set up Wi-Fi yet. Maybe he had forgotten to charge his phone. By the third day, I was starting to feel sick with worry. It wasn't like him to ignore me. At the very least, he would have borrowed someone's phone, found a way to check in. My daughter was too young to have her own phone, but I knew my husband wouldn't just leave me hanging. Something wasn't right. I called the neighbors. I called anyone I could think of. Nobody had seen them. I didn't have anyone else in Spain to check in person. Panic settled in like a weight in my chest. I called the authorities, trying to explain in broken Spanish that I was worried, that my husband and daughter weren't answering, that I needed someone to check the house. I spent that whole night awake, staring at my phone, waiting for it to ring. By the time it finally did, I already knew something was horribly wrong. The voice on the other end of the line spoke carefully. I could tell, even before they explained, that it was bad news. My mind was already running through the worst possibilities. An accident, a robbery, some kind of medical emergency. But nothing prepared me for what they said. They were dead, both of them, my husband and my daughter, found in the house. The room spun around me. My ears were ringing. I was still clutching my phone, still nodding mechanically as the voice explained things I couldn't absorb. I remember catching fragments. Asterisk, no signs of struggle. No break-in. No violence. No visible injuries. Asterisk, just gone. Lifeless. In our new home. I didn't understand. I couldn't understand. It wasn't until later that someone finally explained carbon monoxide poisoning, a silent killer, an undetectable gas that had filled the house. No smell, no warning. They had gone to sleep and never woken up. The new home, the new life. We had been so excited, so focused on getting everything set up that we never even thought to check for something like that. A faulty heater, an unseen leak, a mistake in the installation. That was all it took. Just like that, my family was gone. I don't remember much after that. I remember screaming. I remember breaking things. I remember the flight, sitting in a plane seat, staring blankly at the seatbelt sign, feeling like I was floating outside of my own body. I remember stepping into that house, the house we had dreamed about, and feeling like I was walking into a grave. Their bags were still packed. My daughter's shoes were still by the door. Everything was exactly as they had left it. It didn't feel real. Even as I stood there, staring at their things, it didn't feel real. The next few weeks were a blur. Paperwork, arrangements, flights, my daughter in a small casket, my husband beside her. I remember standing in the cemetery, looking down at them, feeling nothing but a deep, empty coldness inside me. I don't know how I survived it. When I came back, I wasn't the same. I couldn't go back to work. I couldn't function. My job, my plans, my future, it all felt meaningless. I tried at first. I tried to get up, go through the motions. But every time I walked out the door, I saw parents holding their children's hands, families laughing together. Every time I sat at my desk, I thought of my husband calling me that first night, telling me how beautiful the house was. I couldn't do it. I lost everything. At first, I drank to sleep. Then, I drank to forget. Eventually, I drank just to make it through the day. When I finally hit rock bottom, when I finally looked at myself in the mirror and didn't recognize the person staring back at me, it was too late to go back to who I used to be. That's how I ended up here. A cleaner, a nobody, scrubbing floors in houses that aren't mine, walking past children who don't belong to me, listening to parents who still have their futures intact. I know people whisper. I know they wonder why I ended up like this. They don't ask. They don't need to, because the truth is simple. One day, I had everything. A family, a home, a future, and then, in the space of one phone call, I had nothing. I never imagined I'd move back to the farmland my father had left behind when he passed away in 2005. It wasn't something I planned, and it wasn't something I wanted. But after he was gone, life kept moving, and somehow, I found myself back on that land, walking the same dirt paths he had once walked, opening the same doors he had once opened, breathing the same thick country air that used to carry the scent of his aftershave and the lingering aroma of coffee he drank every morning. At the time, my daughter was just over a year old. My husband at the time, now my ex, my sister, and I all moved onto the property together. It made sense. The land was there, the house was standing, and it gave us a fresh start. Or at least, that's what we thought. The farmhouse wasn't modern or fancy, but it was ours. It had been in the family for as long as I could remember, and it carried the weight of every memory we had of my father. There were still traces of him in every room. The way the floorboards creaked in certain places, the faint smell of his cologne in the hallway, the old tools he left in the shed that we hadn't yet moved or touched. At first, it felt like he was still with us in some way, watching over the place like he always had. But then, things started happening. It wasn't anything dramatic at first. Just little things that made me stop and question if I was imagining them. Doors that I was sure I had closed would be open when I turned back around. The radio would turn on by itself, just for a few seconds before shutting off again. My father's old chair at the kitchen table, the one he always sat in, would sometimes be slightly pulled out, like someone had just gotten up from it. I chalked it up to my mind playing tricks on me. Grief does that. It makes you see and hear things that aren't there. It makes you reach for something that no longer exists. But my ex wasn't as dismissive. A few times a week, he would wake me up in the middle of the night, shaking me lightly until my eyes opened just enough to see the worry on his face. It was always the same thing. "There's a man's voice in your sister's room," he would say. I never knew how to respond to that. Half asleep, still tangled in the fog of my dreams, I would mumble the same thing every time. "It's just the old man." And the strange thing was I meant it. Even in that half-conscious state, I knew exactly who the voice belonged to. It was my father. I never questioned it. I never feared it. It was just a fact. He was still there. Some nights, I could hear it myself. Not full conversations, not clear words, just a presence. A deep, muffled voice that sounded like it was coming from the walls, like it was trying to break through, but couldn't quite make it. My sister always denied hearing anything. She would shake her head, roll her eyes, and say it was just the house settling, just the wind, just our imaginations. But I knew better. It all came to a head one night when I was in the kitchen, making a simple potato salad. I had done it 100 times before, cutting the potatoes, mixing the mayonnaise, adding the seasonings. There was nothing unusual about it, until I heard his voice, clear as day, right behind me. "Nile, something is wrong with sister's name." I froze. The knife slipped from my hand, clattering against the counter. A cold wave of dread rushed through me, freezing me in place. My heart slammed against my ribs, and before I could stop myself, I let out a blood-curdling scream. The kind of scream that doesn't just come from your throat. It comes from deep inside, from a place of pure, instinctive terror. My ex came running in, his face pale, his eyes wide with confusion. He grabbed my shoulders, shaking me, asking me what happened. I couldn't even speak. For the next couple of days, I tried to push it out of my mind. I told myself I was imagining things. That grief had finally twisted my brain into something unrecognizable. That I was sleep-deprived, stressed, overwhelmed. That there was no voice. But I couldn't ignore the feeling in my gut. Because it wasn't just the voice. It was everything else. The fleeting glimpses I caught of him in the hallway. Just a shadow moving where no one should be. The way the air in his old bedroom felt heavier, thicker, like stepping into a place where time didn't move. The way my sister seemed off. She had been acting differently for a while, but I had brushed it off as nothing. She was just adjusting to the move, just dealing with her own grief in her own way. That's what I told myself. But after that night in the kitchen, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I sat her down, forced her to talk, and that's when it all came out. She told me everything. She had been suffering in silence, being hurt, being assaulted, and she had told no one. Not me, not our mother, not anyone. She had been carrying it alone, letting it eat away at her from the inside, convincing herself that it was just something she had to endure. And I felt sick. Sick because I hadn't noticed. Sick because she had been in pain for so long, and I had been too blind to see it. Sick because the only person who had noticed was the one person who wasn't even supposed to be here anymore. Our father. He had tried to warn us in the only way he could. Through the whispers in the night, through the glimpses in the hallway, through the voice that spoke my name in the kitchen. He had done what any father would do, protect his child, even from the other side. After that night, everything changed. My sister got help. She found the strength to break free, to speak up, to take back control of her own life. And as she grew stronger, the presence in the house faded. The voices stopped. The glimpses disappeared. My father had done what he needed to do. And then he was gone. The farmhouse felt different after that. Still familiar, still filled with memories, but lighter somehow. Like a weight had been lifted. Like something had been set right. And maybe, in the end, that was all he had been waiting for. There are things in life you remember because they were incredible, things you remember because they were awful, and then things you remember because they were so absurd, so absolutely stupid, that they become legendary. This is one of those stories. It started with a plan, the kind of plan that only comes together when you throw a bunch of young idiots in a car with no real responsibilities and way too much booze. We were going to drive up the east coast of Australia, camping in national parks, drinking ourselves stupid, and just generally existing in that beautiful space between adventure and disaster. We weren't exactly underprepared. If anything, we were overprepared in all the wrong ways. We had enough alcohol to supply a small pub, enough weed to make Snoop Dogg nod in approval, and a generous helping of magic mushrooms for those special moments when reality just wasn't cutting it. I wasn't driving, which meant I had the freedom to be as much of a liability as I wanted to be. Before we even crossed the state border, I tossed back 8 mushroom caps like they were nothing. Maybe it was too much. Maybe it was just enough. Either way, by the time we pulled into the national park, the sun was setting, the air smelled like eucalyptus and campfire smoke, and I was tripping absolute balls. Setting up the camp was a team effort, and I was not part of the team. Every time I tried to be useful, I'd get distracted by the way my hands moved through the air, or by the way the trees seemed to breathe when I looked at them. I ended up just staggering around, laughing at nothing, probably being the least helpful but most entertaining member of the group. The night settled in quickly. We got the fire going, grilled some meat over the flames, and passed around bottles of whiskey like it was the only thing keeping us alive. Gigantic joints made the rounds, thick clouds of smoke rolling up into the canopy, mixing with the night air. Hours blurred together. Time didn't feel real anymore. At some point, I realized something very important, something that cut through the haze of drugs and alcohol like a bullet through glass. I needed to take a shit. It hadn't occurred to us to find a toilet when we arrived, and now that it was pitch black outside, the idea of wandering off into the unknown wasn't exactly appealing. But nature doesn't wait for convenience. When the call comes, you answer it, no matter how drunk or high or generally unprepared you are. I grabbed a roll of toilet paper, strapped a headlamp to my forehead, and, because I wasn't entirely stupid, I took a massive hunting knife with me. Not for any real reason, just for that primal sense of security that comes from knowing you're holding a huge chunk of sharpened steel. With the knife clenched between my teeth like I was some kind of deranged jungle commando, I staggered away from the fire, following a vague path through the trees toward what I assumed was the river. My headlamp cut through the darkness, casting a narrow beam of light that felt both reassuring and deeply unsettling. The further I walked, the more I realized just how far away from camp I was. The laughter and conversation faded behind me, replaced by the chirping of insects and the rustling of unseen creatures in the underbrush. Finally, I reached the riverbank. The water was dark, a slow-moving stretch of liquid reflecting the stars above. It seemed as good a place as any to do what I needed to do. I dropped my pants, squatted down, and braced myself. That's when the hallucinations really kicked in. The first one appeared just at the edge of my vision, something shifting in the shadows beyond the trees. I flicked my headlamp in that direction, and suddenly there they were. Zombies. Rotten, shambling figures, their bodies twisted and decayed, peeling skin barely clinging to bone. Their empty eyes reflected the light from my headlamp as they staggered forward, coming out of the trees, emerging from the darkness surrounding me. Panic surged through me. My breathing turned rapid and shallow, my heart pounding against my ribs like it was trying to escape. But I was not in a position to run. My pants were around my ankles. My ass was hanging out. I was completely, utterly vulnerable. I gritted my teeth, hyperventilating through the knife still clenched in my mouth. My hands shook as I gripped the toilet paper, like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. I forced myself to finish as fast as humanly possible, all while my mind screamed at me that I was about to be torn apart by the undead. The zombies kept coming. Every time I flicked my headlamp in a different direction, more of them appeared, stumbling out of the trees, clawing their way up from the riverbank, their skeletal hands reaching for me. I had never been so terrified in my life. Somehow, I managed to wipe, yank my pants back up, and stagger to my feet, my legs shaking so hard they nearly gave out. The hallucinations weren't stopping. The zombies were still there, their rotting faces twisted in grotesque grins. I did the only thing I could do. I ran. I tore through the darkness, sprinting back toward the campsite, my headlamp bouncing wildly, casting terrifying, shifting shadows in every direction. My breathing was ragged, my limbs felt disconnected from my body, but I had to get back to the others. When I burst into the clearing, I nearly collapsed. The fire was still burning, my friends were still drinking, the world was still normal. The zombies hadn't followed me. I had never felt so relieved in my life. The rest of the night passed in a blur of alcohol, laughter, and the slow, creeping come-down from the mushrooms. I barely remembered getting into my tent, barely remembered falling asleep. But I did remember what happened the next morning. I woke up feeling like death. My mouth was dry, my head was pounding, my stomach was an empty pit of regret. I dragged myself out of my tent, blinking against the morning light, and shuffled over to a tree to take a piss. That's when I saw it. Not 50 meters from our campsite, just behind a small stand of trees, stood a public toilet block. A real, actual, fully functional bathroom. My legs nearly gave out. All that panic, all that terror, the worst, most horrifying shit of my life. And the whole time, salvation had been right there, hidden just out of sight. I stood there for a long time, staring at that goddamn toilet block, and then I laughed. I laughed so hard I had to hold onto the tree to keep from falling over. That was the moment I realized just how ridiculous the entire night had been. The moment I understood that sometimes the scariest things in life are just a mix of bad decisions, bad drugs, and bad timing. And that's the story of the most terrifying shit I've ever taken. I was 7 years old when it happened, though for most of my life, I never thought much of it. It was just a small thing, a passing moment buried under the weight of childhood memories. But years later, when it resurfaced, it hit me like a freight train. The kind of realization that makes your stomach drop and your skin go cold. The kind that makes you wonder how close you came to something terrible, something that could have changed everything. Back then, I spent a lot of time at my aunt's house. She lived in the country, a place where the land stretched out for miles in every direction. It was mostly fields and dirt roads, with scattered trees lining the edges of old fences. Her front yard wasn't much of a yard at all, just a stretch of gravel and patches of stubborn grass. She liked to keep it neat, though, and one of my usual chores was raking the rocks back into place after the rain washed them around. That's what I was doing that day. The sun was high, the air thick and warm, the kind of heat that made the ground smell like dry earth, and the inside of my shirt stick to my back. I was just a kid, swinging a metal rake back and forth, pushing small stones into place like it mattered. In my head, I wasn't working. I was just killing time. I remember the sound first. The crunch of tires on gravel. Slow, deliberate. I looked up and saw the truck rolling to a stop a little ways down the road, just past the driveway. It wasn't a nice truck. It was old beat to hell, the kind of vehicle that had seen too many years and too many miles. Rust ate away at the edges, patches of missing paint exposing dull metal underneath. The windows were rolled down, but I couldn't see inside. I went back to raking, barely paying attention. Cars drove by all the time, usually neighbors or people cutting through to the next road over. But this truck didn't keep going. The driver's side door opened with a loud creak, and a man stepped out. He didn't look like much. Dirty jeans, a stained t-shirt, the kind of worn-out boots that had seen more work than I ever had at that age. His hair was messy, his face rough with stubble. He wasn't old, but not young either. Maybe mid-30s, but when you're 7, all adults look the same. I kept working, but I watched him out of the corner of my eye. He walked to the front of the truck, lifted the hood, and fiddled with something inside. I didn't think much of it. People had car trouble all the time. It was normal. Then he closed the hood and looked over at me. That was the first moment I felt something. A shift in the air. A prickle at the back of my neck. Not fear, not yet, but something else. A kind of awareness. I was alone. My aunt was inside. My mom was somewhere in the garage, but out of sight. No one was watching. And then he spoke. I don't remember the exact words, but I know what he asked me. He wanted to know if I could pop a clutch. I didn't know how. Growing up on a farm, you learn things like that early. I'd seen my dad do it plenty of times, and I'd helped before. It wasn't hard. I told him yes. And then I started walking toward his truck. Even now, that moment makes my stomach turn. That single step forward. That instant where my life could have split in two. I didn't feel afraid. I didn't hesitate. I was just a kid, and he was an adult asking for help. That's all it was in my head. Then my mom called my name. I turned. It wasn't urgent, not a yell, just a casual call from the garage. But in that split second, everything changed. I looked back toward her, just for a moment, just long enough to register her voice. I never heard the truck door open, but I heard it slam shut. By the time I turned back around, the truck was already moving. The engine roared to life, tires spitting gravel as it pulled away fast. Too fast for someone who had just been asking for help. The dust kicked up behind it, and then it was gone, disappearing down the road. I stood there, rake still in my hands, watching until there was nothing left to see. I didn't think much about it. Not then. I turned back to my mom, saw her standing in the doorway of the garage. She hadn't been looking at the truck. She hadn't noticed anything. I went back to raking, and that was it. For years, I never thought about it. It just blended into the background noise of my childhood, another meaningless moment lost in the shuffle of growing up. It wasn't a story I told. It wasn't a thing that stuck with me. It just disappeared. Until it didn't. It happened almost 30 years later. I don't know what triggered it. I was getting into bed, settling in after a long day, when out of nowhere, the memory surfaced. Not just surfaced, hit me like a hammer. I sat up so fast my heart felt like it might explode. My chest was tight, my hands shaking before I even knew why. And then I saw it. Every detail, perfectly clear. The truck, the man, the way he left. I wasn't helping him. I wasn't supposed to pop a clutch. I was walking straight toward the passenger side door of a running vehicle, and he was waiting for me. I think that's what scared me the most. The realization that he had planned it, that he had stopped in the middle of nowhere, pretending to have engine trouble, just in case the kid raking rocks in the yard knew enough about cars to fall for it, that he had left the door unlocked, ready. And if my mom hadn't called my name at that exact moment, I don't know. I don't know what would have happened. I spent the next 30 minutes shaking, my body reacting in a way it hadn't back then, because back then, I hadn't understood. Now I did. Now I knew exactly what bullet I had dodged. And I knew that somewhere, out there, was a man who had driven away from that yard alone, who had been forced to leave empty-handed. And I wondered, who hadn't? I was 12 years old when this happened. I still think about it more than I'd like to, not just because of how it felt in the moment, but because of how impossible it was. I try not to let my mind dwell on things I can't explain, but this was different. I wasn't alone when it happened. My dad saw it too. That's what makes it hard to ignore. We were in his bedroom that evening, just me and him. The house was quiet. I don't remember exactly what we were talking about, just that it was a normal conversation, something casual, something safe. There was nothing strange about the night. No eerie feeling in the air. No sense that something was off. Just a regular moment between a father and his son. The bedroom was dim, but the light from the hallway spilled in through the open door, giving the room a soft glow. The closet, though, was dark. The door was open, and inside, we could see my mom folding clothes. Or at least, we thought we could. She was standing there, moving slowly, methodically. Her outline was clear enough. She always wore her hair in a bun, and that's what we saw, her familiar shape, her hair pulled up the way it always was. She didn't speak, but that wasn't strange. She was probably just focused on what she was doing. At some point, my dad called out to her. I don't remember what he asked, but there was no response. He called her name again. Nothing. It was only then that I started to feel something was off. I couldn't say why, but the silence from the closet felt heavier than it should have. Dad tried again, raising his voice slightly, but still she didn't answer. His tone shifted. The patience in his voice started to fade, replaced by irritation. Are you ignoring me? I could hear the frustration building. Still no response. No acknowledgement. I glanced at the closet, feeling a slight unease now. The shape was still there, still moving the same way, still folding clothes in that slow, deliberate manner. It didn't make sense. Dad's irritation turned into anger. He was never the type to let things slide, especially when it came to being ignored. His voice got louder, sharper. Then, just as he was about to get up, I heard movement behind me. Soft footsteps. And then my mom's voice. What are you yelling for? I turned my head so fast it almost hurt. My mom was standing in the doorway. Her hair was wet, twisted up in a towel. She was fresh out of the shower. For a second, my mind didn't work. I looked at her, really looked at her. Then I turned back to the closet. It was empty. There was nothing inside but clothes, shoes, and the usual mess. The shape we had seen was gone. Completely gone. I felt something cold settle in my chest. My stomach twisted. I couldn't explain what I was seeing, or rather, what I wasn't seeing. I looked at my dad. He looked at me. Neither of us spoke. We didn't have to. We had both seen it. We had both been watching her, or what we thought was her, standing in the closet folding clothes. But my mom had never been there. She had been in the shower the whole time. I couldn't move for a few seconds. My mind was racing. I replayed the past few minutes in my head, trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe the darkness of the closet had played tricks on us. Maybe we had assumed we saw her because we expected to. Maybe. But that didn't make sense. We had seen her bun. The way she stood. The way she moved. That was not a trick of the light. That was not our imagination filling in the blanks. It was there. It had been real. And yet it wasn't. Dad didn't yell anymore. He didn't even say anything to my mom. He just sat there, silent, staring at the closet with a look I had never seen on his face before. It wasn't just confusion. It was something deeper. Something unsettled. I felt like I was moving in slow motion as I finally got up and walked toward the closet. I don't know what I expected to see. Maybe some kind of explanation hidden in the shadows, but it was just a closet. Just clothes. Just normal things. I reached out and flicked on the light. The brightness made the room feel different, more ordinary. But that didn't change the fact that, moments ago, something had been there. Something that looked exactly like my mom. I took a step back, my heart pounding harder now. I felt exposed standing there, like I was too close to something I didn't understand. Dad finally broke the silence. "Let's just forget it." He said it so quietly I almost didn't hear him. But there was no mistaking the tension in his voice. He wasn't asking. He was telling me, "Forget it. Move on. Don't talk about it." And so I didn't. At least, not for a long time. The house never felt quite the same after that. I didn't tell my mom what had happened. I didn't even want to think about it. But sometimes, when I passed by my parents' room, I'd catch myself glancing at the closet, half expecting to see something standing there again. I never did, but the memory of that night never left me. Even now, I can still picture it clearly. The dim light, the dark closet, the steady movement of hands folding clothes. The way it all felt so normal, right up until the moment it wasn't. I've tried to come up with a logical explanation over the years, but I can't. There isn't one. And the worst part, I know my dad still remembers it too. Because every once in a while, when the conversation drifts towards strange experiences or things we can't explain, he gets quiet. He doesn't join in. And if I ever mention that night, just to see his reaction, he always does the same thing. He shakes his head and changes the subject. After 7 days in the backcountry, the modern world didn't feel real anymore. The sounds of people talking, car doors slamming, and the hum of engines idling in the parking lot at Canoe Lake all felt distant, like I was hearing them through a thick pane of glass. My muscles ached from a week of paddling and portaging, my clothes smelled of wood smoke and lake water, and my skin was still damp with sweat from the final stretch of the trip. But despite the exhaustion, there was a deep satisfaction in it, an almost primal sense of accomplishment. 7 days of paddling through Algonquin's endless lakes and rivers, sleeping under the stars, cooking over an open flame. It was the kind of exhaustion that felt earned. I tossed my heavy pack down next to my car, stretching out my shoulders and taking a deep breath. The air smelled of wet leaves, pine needles, and that distinct earthy scent of damp soil. My canoe was still strapped to the roof, streaked with dried mud from dragging it across portages. I had barely started unpacking when I heard it, excited, almost frantic chatter coming from 2 cars over. I turned my head toward the noise, and that's when I saw it. A bull moose. It was massive. I had seen moose before, but never this close, and never one this big. The sheer size of it was overwhelming. The towering height, the broad shoulders, the thick neck, the heavy antlers that seemed to stretch wider than the car it was walking past. Its dark brown coat was matted and thick, the muscles beneath it shifting with every slow, deliberate step. It moved with a strange combination of grace and weight, its hooves clicking softly against the asphalt as it made its way through the parking lot. Everything else in the world disappeared in that moment. My breath caught in my throat. My heart pounded. My body went rigid with the kind of instinctual fear that only comes from being in the presence of something truly wild. I dropped into a crouch behind my car, peeking over the hood with my phone in my hand. My first thought was to film it. Of course, how could I not? But my second thought, the one that came just a split second later, was that I needed to stay completely still. Moose are unpredictable, and a bull of this size, if it felt threatened, if something startled it, it could charge. It could destroy a car without effort. And if I was caught in the open, there would be no chance of outrunning it. I hit record. The moose continued its slow, steady path through the parking lot, completely unbothered by the people around it. Most had the good sense to stay put, watching in stunned silence. A few, like me, hid behind their cars. But not everyone was being cautious. I heard movement to my right, the shuffling of footsteps on gravel, the sharp click of a phone camera. I turned my head just enough to see him. Some guy, probably a tourist, stepping out from behind his car. He was maybe in his late 20s, wearing a bright yellow jacket that stood out like a beacon against the muted colors of the parking lot. He held his phone out in front of him, angling for the perfect shot. And then, unbelievably, he took a step forward. I tensed. The moose hadn't noticed him yet, still moving at its own unhurried pace. But the guy didn't stop. He kept walking, slow at first, but then faster, closing the gap between him and the bull like he was approaching some kind of tame zoo animal. His arms stretched out, his fingers twitching as if he was actually going to touch it. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Every single instinct in my body was screaming. My stomach knotted. My breathing stopped. This was insane. This was a fully grown bull moose, a wild animal that could kill him in seconds, and he was walking right up to it like it was some friendly farm horse. The last few feet closed fast. The moose lifted its head. For the first time, it seemed to actually register the man's presence. It stopped walking. Its massive body went still, and then it turned its head toward him. The guy froze. For a moment, there was absolute silence. No movement, no sound, just a heavy, suffocating stillness. I could see it so clearly. The moose's eyes, dark and unreadable, locked onto him. Its nostrils flared. Its ears flicked forward. Its entire body tensed, muscles coiling, its hooves shifting slightly on the asphalt. Then, without warning, it snorted. The sound was loud and sharp, a sudden burst of breath that sent a visible puff of mist into the cool air. The force of it was enough to make the guy flinch, stumbling backward a step. But that tiny movement was all it took. The moose bolted. It turned and took off, moving in that strange, long-legged gallop that moose do when they decide they're done with the situation. Hooves clattered against the pavement, the sound echoing through the parking lot as it sprinted toward the tree line. But the guy, he chased it. I couldn't process it. He actually took off running after the moose, still holding his phone up like he was trying to get a selfie with it. I felt my stomach drop. This was the moment I thought I was about to witness a real-life Darwin Award. The moose was fast, much faster than him. It reached the tree line in seconds, disappearing into the dense forest beyond the parking lot. But the guy kept going, running full speed straight into the woods after it. His bright yellow jacket vanished into the trees, his footsteps fading as he went deeper. And then silence. No more footsteps. No shouting. Nothing. I waited, barely breathing, my heart still hammering in my chest. I don't know what I expected. Maybe the sound of a crash. Maybe a scream. Maybe the horrifying snap of breaking bones. But nothing came. Minutes passed. Then finally I saw him again. He emerged from the trees, panting, his jacket streaked with dirt and twigs stuck in his hair. His phone was still clutched in his hand, the screen glowing faintly. But his expression had changed. He wasn't grinning anymore. He looked shaken. He walked back to his car without a word, got in, and slammed the door. The parking lot gradually returned to normal. People started talking again. The sounds of car engines starting up filled the air, and life resumed as if nothing had happened. I stayed behind my car for a long time, just staring at the spot where the moose had vanished. Eventually, I finished packing up. I unstrapped my canoe, tied everything down, and got into my car. My hands were still trembling slightly as I gripped the wheel. As I pulled out of the lot, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just watched someone come inches away from a violent, stupid death. And the worst part, I wasn't even sure if he really understood how close he had been. Sequoia National Park was one of my favorite places to camp, and I had planned this trip for weeks. The idea was simple: leave late at night, drive through the dark, set up camp under the stars, and wake up before the crowds arrived. It was the best way to experience the park without dealing with the usual tourists who clogged the trails during the day. My friend and I packed up the car with all the essentials: tent, sleeping bags, food, extra clothes, and a couple of small lanterns. I liked being prepared, especially in places as remote as Sequoia. It wasn't just about comfort, it was about safety. The park was deep in the mountains, with long, winding roads that cut through dense forest. And once you got in far enough, there was no cell service. If something went wrong, you were on your own. We left the city late, probably around 9:30 p.m. I drove while my friend dozed off in the passenger seat, their head against the window. The road stretched ahead, dark and empty, with only my headlights cutting through the blackness. Every now and then, I'd pass a reflective road sign or the glowing eyes of some small animal darting into the brush. But for the most part, it was just me, the road, and the sound of the tires humming beneath us. It was past midnight when we finally reached the entrance to the park. The air was different up here, cooler, thinner, carrying that distinct scent of pine and damp earth. The trees loomed tall on either side of the road, their trunks vanishing into darkness. I slowed the car a little, letting my eyes adjust to the dim light. Even with my high beams on, the road twisted unpredictably, and the last thing I wanted was to take a turn too fast and end up in a ditch. Then I saw it. At first, it was just a strange glinting in the distance, something catching the reflection of my headlights. I squinted, trying to make sense of it. The road ahead was empty, no signs, no parked cars. Just a dark stretch of asphalt cutting through the forest. But as I got closer, the glinting took shape, something large, something solid. A cow, a full-grown cow, standing right in the middle of the road. I hit the brakes hard, the tires screeching against the pavement. My friend jolted awake, mumbling something, but I barely heard them. My focus was locked on the massive animal ahead of us. The cow stood completely still, its dark body almost blending into the night. Its eyes reflected the light, glowing like two eerie white orbs. It didn't move. It didn't seem startled by my approach. Just stood there. I sat gripping the steering wheel, my heart pounding. This didn't make sense. There were no farms nearby, no open pastures. We were deep in the mountains, surrounded by towering trees and steep slopes. There was no reason a cow should be here, in the middle of a national park. I took a shaky breath and tapped the horn. A short, sharp beep. The cow didn't react. I flicked my high beams on and off. Nothing. It just stood there, its head slightly lowered, staring. A weird feeling crept over me, a slow, sinking unease. I had expected the cow to at least flinch, to acknowledge my presence. But it was as if it didn't care. Or worse, as if it didn't see me at all. I wasn't sure what to do. I couldn't drive around it. The road was narrow, with steep drop-offs on one side and thick forest on the other. Backing up wasn't really an option either. The road had been winding, and trying to reverse through all those curves in the dark was a disaster waiting to happen. I honked again, longer this time. The cow shifted slightly, turning its head just a fraction. But instead of moving off the road, it took a slow step forward. Then another. Something about the way it moved made my stomach tighten. Its legs were stiff, its steps slow and deliberate. Like it wasn't just walking, like it was moving toward something. Toward us. I glanced at my friend, who was wide awake now, eyes darting between me and the cow. They looked as uneasy as I felt. I gripped the wheel and did the only thing I could think of. I rolled down my window and shouted, "Hey, get out of the road." The words felt ridiculous the moment they left my mouth, but I didn't know what else to do. The cow stopped. Its head jerked up slightly, its ears twitching. For the first time, I could see it more clearly in the beams of my headlights. Its hide was rough, dirt-streaked. Its ribs were faintly visible beneath its skin. Something about it looked off, like it wasn't supposed to be alive. I swallowed hard. My pulse thumped in my ears. This wasn't just some lost farm animal. Something was wrong with it. Then, without warning, it let out a deep, guttural sound. Not quite a moo, not quite a growl, something in between. Low and unnatural. And then it moved. Fast. It lurched forward in a sudden, jerky motion, breaking into a stumbling run straight at the car. I didn't think. I just reacted. I slammed the gas pedal, tires screeching as the car shot forward. I swerved hard, barely missing the animal as I veered onto the narrow shoulder. The side of the car scraped against the dirt embankment, and for a second, I thought we were going to tip. Then the road straightened, and I gripped the wheel, forcing the car back onto the pavement. My breath came in short gasps. My friend was gripping the dashboard, eyes wide with shock. I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cow was gone. I didn't see it anywhere. Just empty roads stretching behind us, fading into darkness. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I drove until we reached our campsite, my hands still shaking on the wheel. We set up the tent in silence. Neither of us spoke about what had happened. Not then, but later, after we had calmed down, we did some research. And what we found didn't make things any better. Cattle sometimes wandered into Sequoia National Park, but not this deep, not this high up, and certainly not alone. And the way it had moved, something had been wrong with that cow. I don't know what it was. I don't think I want to know. All I know is that I'll never drive through that park at night again. The first time I ever went camping, I hated it. It was a school trip, 7th grade, way out in the middle of nowhere. 5 hours from home, shoved into a cabin full of girls I barely knew, sleeping on a stiff wooden cot that felt like it was built to break my back. The air smelled like dirt and pine, thick and heavy with humidity, and every sound outside made my skin crawl. Bugs chirping, wind moving through the trees, branches snapping somewhere in the distance. It was all just too much. I wasn't built for the outdoors. I wanted my bed, my house. I wanted walls that didn't feel paper thin, where I didn't have to hear every breath and rustle of sleeping bags from the other girls. I wasn't even friends with them, just classmates, thrown together because we had the same last-minute cabin assignment. I barely spoke to anyone the entire trip. By the time midnight rolled around, I knew there was no way I was sleeping. I tossed and turned, pulled my sleeping bag tighter, tried closing my eyes and forcing myself to drift off, but it never worked. The cabin was too hot, too stuffy. My skin stuck to the sheets, and every time I moved, the cot groaned loud enough to make me wince. I gave up. Slipping as quietly as I could out of bed, I grabbed my book and my little book light. The pages were already dog-eared from how many times I'd flipped through them. I was obsessed with Christopher Pike books at that age. Horror, suspense, all those pulpy, creepy stories that made my heart race. But I'd have taken anything at that point. Anything to take my mind off how miserable I felt. I crept to the door, careful not to wake anyone. It was easier than I thought it would be. Most of them were deep asleep, wrapped in their sleeping bags like burritos, completely oblivious. I envied them. I wanted to sleep that easily. The door creaked when I opened it. I cringed but kept going, stepping out into the night. The air was cooler outside, but not by much. It smelled stronger, fresher, like damp wood and leaves, and the sky was an inky, endless black, broken only by a smear of stars. The cabins were spaced apart, but not too far, just enough that I couldn't see into any of the other ones. Just enough to make me feel isolated. I sat down just outside the door, pulling my knees up to my chest. The book light clicked on, its tiny beam of white-yellow light just strong enough to illuminate the words on the page. I tried to lose myself in the story, but I couldn't. Something felt wrong. It wasn't loud. It wasn't obvious. Just a feeling, like the air had changed. The hairs on my arms and the back of my neck stood up, and I caught myself glancing up every few seconds, scanning the trees, the paths, the dark space between the cabins. Nothing. I swallowed and turned back to my book, but I still couldn't shake it. It felt like I was being watched. I told myself I was being ridiculous. It was camp. There were teachers, counselors, other kids. It wasn't like I was alone out here, but the feeling didn't go away. Then I saw it. The book shifted slightly in my hands, tilting the light just right, and for half a second, I caught the reflection of a pair of glowing eyes. My stomach turned to ice. At first, I thought I imagined it. Maybe it was the light catching on something, some animal lower to the ground, a raccoon or a fox. But as soon as I moved, the book tilted again, and the eyes caught the light a second time. They were still there, still watching me. I barely breathed. It took my brain a second to register what I was seeing. The glowing reflection, the position, the height. My first thought was dog. Someone's pet, maybe. A stray. But no one had brought dogs. It wasn't allowed. Then I saw the paw. Not small. Not the delicate shape of a fox or a coyote. A massive, muscular paw, resting just at the edge of the steps. I didn't move. I followed the shape up, slowly, carefully, until I saw the rest of it. A mountain lion. The realization hit me like a freight train. I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs, my hands going numb. I didn't even realize I'd dropped the book until the light flickered off to the side, leaving me half in darkness. It was staring at me. I don't know how long we held eye contact. It felt like hours. I knew, somewhere deep in my mind, that if I ran, I was dead. If I screamed, I was dead. If I moved too fast, I was dead. All I could think was two things. 1, someone was going to find my half-eaten body in the morning. 2, my dad was going to be so mad at me for getting killed because I snuck out of the cabin. My limbs felt like they were made of cement. I tried to breathe as quietly as I could, barely daring to move. My body was screaming at me to run, but I knew better. I had to know better. My fingers twitched. I forced myself to move slowly. Up behind me, toward the door handle. The second my fingers brushed it, I felt a fresh wave of panic. If it was locked, I was dead. I had no idea if it locked automatically or not. I twisted. It moved. I didn't even think. I threw myself backward into the cabin, landing hard on my tailbone, yanking the door shut as fast as I could. Silence. For a second, I just sat there, wide-eyed, staring at the closed door, waiting to hear something. A thump. A scratch. A sound of movement. Nothing. I waited. Nothing. I scrambled back into bed, my whole body shaking so hard I thought I might be sick. I pulled the blanket over my head and lay there, staring at the inside of the fabric, waiting for morning. One girl stirred next to me. I must have made noise. I heard her shift groggy. And then, did you hear that? I didn't say anything. I couldn't. The door. The book. I didn't want to get in trouble. Wind, I muttered. She made a sleepy noise and rolled over. I didn't sleep. When morning finally came, I sat up, still feeling like I was moving in slow motion. I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it, that I'd been dreaming. Then our teacher walked in and frowned at me. "Why is your library book outside?" I went cold. I never went back to get it. I didn't say a word. I just got up, walked outside, and picked it up. It was damp with morning dew, the book light lying next to it. I glanced toward the steps. There, in the dirt, was a single massive paw print. I swallowed hard, grabbed my book, and walked back inside. I never told anyone. This was my first real call. I had barely settled into my shift, still shaking off the morning stiffness, when the siren went off. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the radio. "RTA, high impact, multiple casualties reported." I barely had time to register what was happening before we were on the truck, tearing through the city streets. The older guys were focused, calm. I wasn't. My heart was hammering, my hands sweating. This was the job, but this was also real. Someone's worst day was about to become my first. We pulled up to the intersection, sirens wailing, but the scene was already deadly silent. The air smelled like burned rubber and oil. The intersection was littered with shattered glass, chunks of metal, and the distant wail of an approaching ambulance. A black sedan sat in the middle of the road. Its passenger side caved in so deep it barely looked like there was space left inside. A pickup truck rested nearby, its front end destroyed, steam rising from the crumpled hood. The driver of the pickup, a man in his 40s, sat on the curb, bleeding from a gash on his forehead, clutching his arm, staring blankly at the wreckage. His eyes were wide, unfocused. A cop knelt beside him, asking questions, but the man barely seemed to hear. Then there was him. The driver of the sedan, a man in his 30s, swayed on his feet. His shirt was wrinkled, stained with something dark, not blood, but maybe spilled beer or sweat. He reeked of alcohol, and his eyes were glassy, unfocused. He was smiling. He was laughing. He stumbled toward us, gesturing wildly at the wreckage. "Come on, guys. Get her out already. She's waiting." I felt something tighten in my chest. I followed his gaze to the car. The woman, his wife, was still inside. From the driver's side, it didn't look too bad. She was leaning over, slumped forward, like she had just unbuckled her seatbelt, and was reaching across the center console to open the door. No blood, no visible wounds. Just still. Too still. But the passenger's side, where the pickup had struck, was gone. The metal had crumpled inward like a fist had smashed into the side of the car, compacting everything. The door was crushed into what used to be the passenger seat. The dashboard had caved in, pinning her legs. She hadn't just been reaching across. The impact had forced her body over, twisting her torso at an unnatural angle. And she wasn't moving. One of the paramedics was already checking her. I watched as he placed 2 fingers against her neck, then moved to her wrist. He glanced at another paramedic and shook his head. No pulse. The driver kept laughing, kept talking to the police like this was some minor inconvenience. "Come on, we're late." "She's fine. Let's go." The paramedics exchanged a look. The senior guy, a man who had probably seen hundreds of these scenes, stood up, exhaled through his nose, and motioned for us to move. We started trying to extract her. We couldn't open the passenger side. It was too crushed. We'd have to pull her out from the driver's side. I was closest, so I crouched low and reached in, trying to get a grip under her arms. And that's when I saw it. Her lower body, everything from the pelvis down, was gone. Not missing, but destroyed. Her left hip was completely crushed where the door had slammed into her. A jagged piece of metal had impaled her through the abdomen, holding her in place. Beneath the wreckage, I could see the glisten of exposed muscle, the unnatural angles of broken bone. She had been alive for minutes after the crash, sitting like that. She had bled out before anyone could reach her. I felt something cold settle into my stomach. We had to tell him. The second we said it, ***, she's gone. Everything changed. The driver's face shifted. First, disbelief. He blinked, mouth slightly open, head shaking like he was waiting for someone to tell him it was a joke. Then realization. Then desperation. He pushed past us. Before we could stop him, he was at the driver's side, grabbing her arms, pulling her toward him. And that's when the wound tore open. A deep, wet sound, flesh separating, a thick tearing noise as whatever was left inside her body gave way. Blood spilled from her abdomen, thick and dark. We grabbed him, pulled him back, but he fought, screaming. He broke free and ran to the passenger side, where the door was crumpled shut. He dug his fingers into the twisted metal, trying to pry it open with his bare hands. He was screaming. Not words, not sentences, just raw, desperate sounds. The kind of sound that comes from a place too deep for words. It took 2 cops to drag him away. By the time we finished, the paramedics had covered the wife's body with a white sheet. The driver sat on the curb, head in his hands, still shaking. We left him there. The cops would handle the rest. Back at the station, I couldn't shake it. The way he had laughed. The way he had fumbled around, still drunk, not understanding what had happened. Then the way he had fought, clawed, screamed when the truth finally sank in. I kept seeing his hands, covered in his wife's blood. I kept hearing the way the wound had torn. I kept thinking about how she had sat there for minutes, twisted in the wreckage, bleeding out while he laughed outside. The news ran a short piece about it that afternoon. Early morning crash claims the life of a young woman. Authorities confirm alcohol was a factor in the accident. The driver sustained no major injuries. The victim was pronounced dead at the scene. That was it. Just another accident. Just another morning. For us, it was time to wash up, grab a coffee, wait for the next call. For him, it was the moment his life ended. And the worst part, I couldn't feel sorry for him. I just couldn't. For years ago, I was driving home from Yosemite National Park. It was late afternoon, somewhere around 5 p.m., and the sun was starting to hang lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the winding roads. The drive itself had been uneventful, just miles of empty highway cutting through dense wilderness, with the occasional car passing in the opposite direction. I'd spent the last few days hiking and camping alone, and while I loved being in the outdoors, I was looking forward to a real bed and a long shower. The scent of pine and dirt still clung to my clothes, and my legs were sore from the miles I had trekked. My backpack sat in the passenger seat, crammed with leftover snacks, a half-empty water bottle, and the gear I hadn't bothered to pack neatly. At some point during the drive, I felt the urge to pee. It wasn't urgent, but I knew there wouldn't be many gas stations or rest stops for miles. I figured I'd just pull over and take a quick leak by the tree line. There was no one around, no cars behind me, no headlights in the distance, just me and the road stretching ahead, empty and quiet. I slowed down and pulled onto the shoulder, gravel crunching under my tires. I didn't bother turning off the engine. I just left it running, headlights cutting a beam of light into the dimming forest. I stepped out, stretching my legs before making my way a few feet into the trees. The air was still warm but cooling off, and the smell of dry earth and pine needles filled my nose. As I unzipped my pants, I heard them. Birds. Their chirping had been constant since I'd stepped out of the truck. Nothing unusual, just the normal chatter of small songbirds in the trees. But then, without warning, the sound stopped. Not faded, not slowed down. It stopped, all at once. The sudden silence was deafening. 1 second, the trees were alive with sound, and the next, it was as if someone had pressed a mute button on the entire forest. I felt a wave of unease creep over me. Silence in the woods is never a good sign. I had camped and hiked enough to know that when birds and insects stop making noise, it usually means one thing: a predator is nearby. A bear, maybe a cougar, something big enough to send everything else into hiding. I cut it short, zipped up, and turned toward my truck. It was only about 30 feet away, but in that moment, it felt a lot farther. I walked briskly, trying not to look panicked, but every instinct in my body was screaming at me to move faster. Then, just as I reached the edge of the trees, it happened. A sound tore through the silence. Loud, insanely loud, a mix between a scream and an air raid siren. It came from somewhere behind me, deep in the woods, and it was close. Too close. I froze. My entire body locked up as adrenaline flooded my veins. I had never heard anything like it in my life. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a cougar. It wasn't any animal I had ever heard before. The noise was shrill, almost metallic, like the grinding of metal on metal mixed with a high-pitched wail. It echoed through the trees, bouncing off the trunks and making it impossible to tell exactly where it had come from. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. For a second, I stood there, heart hammering, breath coming in short, panicked gasps. My legs felt weak, like they didn't belong to me anymore. Every hair on my body stood on end. Then I ran. I sprinted full speed back to my truck, slamming the door shut and locking it in one motion. My hands fumbled as I threw the truck into drive, gravel spraying from my tires as I floored the gas pedal. The sound of my engine roared through the empty road. But before I could speed off, it happened again. Louder this time. The same ear-splitting wail, but closer. Almost right outside my truck. The sheer volume of it rattled my chest, vibrated in my skull, made my vision blur for half a second. My hands were shaking as I gripped the steering wheel, my breath coming in ragged gasps. And then I was gone. I didn't look back. I didn't slow down. I just drove. For the next 10 miles, I kept checking my rearview mirror, expecting to see something, anything chasing me. But the road was empty, stretching behind me like nothing had happened. It wasn't until I was back on the main highway, surrounded by other cars and streetlights, that I finally let out the breath I hadn't realized I was holding. My hands were still trembling. My heart was still racing. I don't know what I heard that evening. I have replayed that moment in my head countless times, trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe it was some kind of animal I'd never heard before, something rare that only comes out at dusk. Maybe it was a freak sound carrying through the canyon in a way that made it seem unnatural. But deep down, I don't believe that. I know the sounds of the forest. I know what bears sound like, what cougars sound like, what owls and foxes and elk sound like. That wasn't any of them. And whatever it was, it knew I was there. This happened on private property, but it still creeps me out to this day. Every time I think about it, my stomach knots up, and I feel that same cold grip of fear I felt in the woods that morning. My dad acts like it never happened, like it was just another normal hunting trip. But I know what I saw. It was opening day of deer season, and my dad and I were hunting on my cousin's land in western Wisconsin. His property had a lot of hills, thick woods, and plenty of deer, which made it a great spot for hunting. Every year, it was tradition for all of us to gather there. My dad, my cousin, and some of their friends had built a hunting shack deep in the woods. A simple but sturdy place with a small wood stove, a couple of chairs, and a table where we kept a schedule of who was hunting where. It helped us avoid accidents and made sure we didn't step on each other's toes while looking for deer. That morning, my dad and I were the first ones out. We marked which hill we were going to on the schedule, even though nobody else had arrived yet. The sun wasn't up yet when we took the ATV up one of the hills. The air was freezing, and the sky had that deep dark blue color just before sunrise. The woods were quiet, except for the occasional rustle of dry leaves when the wind picked up. It felt like one of those perfect mornings for hunting. We set up in a good spot overlooking a clearing, rifles ready, waiting for the deer to start moving. But nothing happened. Not a single sound. No squirrels, no birds, nothing. We sat there for hours in complete silence, except for the occasional creak of our tree stands when we shifted our weight. Around 9 a.m., we finally decided to head back to the shack for some coffee. I climbed down first, then waited for my dad to join me. The walk back to the ATV was slow. Every few minutes, we'd stop to listen for movement in the woods. Still nothing. It was strange. Usually, even if we didn't see deer, there'd at least be some kind of noise. The forest never stayed this quiet for this long. About halfway back to the ATV, I started hearing something that didn't sit right with me. It only happened when we were moving. When my dad and I walked, I mimicked his footsteps, stepping when he stepped, to make less noise. But I was hearing an extra step. It was out of sync with us. At first, I thought I was imagining it. But the longer we walked, the clearer it became. It wasn't just the sound of leaves crunching. It was deliberate. Someone, or something, was stepping when I stepped, almost as if it was trying to match me. I stopped walking. My dad took another step before noticing I had stopped, then turned to look at me. I wasn't even looking at him. My eyes were locked on the trees behind us. Nothing moved. The sun still hadn't made it over the top of the hill yet, so the woods were covered in deep shade. but something was wrong. I couldn't explain it, but I could feel it. My skin was crawling. We kept walking. I forced myself to keep moving, telling myself it was just my imagination. But then I heard it again. I didn't stop this time. I turned my head while I was still walking. That's when I saw it. Something ducked behind a tree about 30 yards uphill from us. It moved fast, but I caught enough of a glimpse to know it wasn't an animal. It was too tall, too human-shaped. I felt my heart hammering in my chest, and a wave of cold fear washed over me. My throat went dry. I didn't say anything. I just kept walking, faster this time, trying to act like I hadn't seen it. But then it peeked out again. A pale face, barely visible through the shadows, staring straight at me. It ducked back again, then peeked out once more. This time, it didn't move away. It just stared. My breathing was too loud in my ears, my pulse thumping in my skull. The face was wrong. Even from a distance, something about it wasn't right. I didn't blink. I just kept my eyes on it, my legs moving on autopilot. Then I felt my dad stop beside me. He had seen it too. We didn't say a word. We just kept moving, faster this time, practically speed walking toward the ATV. I didn't dare look back again, but I could hear it. Footsteps. Something was following us. Not running, not charging, just walking. Steady, deliberate, keeping pace with us. By the time we reached the ATV, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely climb onto the seat. My dad didn't waste time. He started it up immediately. As the engine roared to life, I turned my head one last time. The thing stepped out from behind the tree. Its body was thin, almost malnourished, with long, bony arms and legs. The way it moved didn't look natural. It wasn't limping, but it had a strange, jerky motion to it, like its joints didn't work right. Its skin was pale, too pale, like it had never seen sunlight. I only saw it for a second before my dad hit the throttle and we tore out of there. Neither of us said a word as we sped down the trail, the ATV bouncing over roots and rocks. I gripped the seat so hard my knuckles turned white, my breath coming in short, shaky bursts. When we reached the hunting shack, we didn't even go inside. My dad shut off the ATV, and for a moment, we just sat there. The woods were quiet again, but not in a peaceful way. It was the kind of quiet that felt heavy, like something was still watching us. My dad didn't look at me. He just got into the truck. I followed. We left. Neither of us talked about it on the drive home. My dad just turned on the radio and acted like nothing had happened. The next morning, he went back out. He got his deer. He came home, cleaned it, and never mentioned anything about what we saw. It was like he had erased it from his mind. But I haven't. I haven't been back to those woods since. I won't go back, because I know what I saw. Camping has always been a big part of my family's life. Every year, we head out to a national park a few hours away from home, but we don't stick to the regular campgrounds. We prefer to take old logging roads, pushing deeper into the woods where we can set up camp in complete privacy. Over the years, we've found some amazing spots, hidden clearings, quiet lakes, and places so untouched by other campers that they feel like our own secret hideaways. When I was 13, we found one of the best spots we'd ever come across. It was nestled between two large ponds, completely surrounded by dense trees and brush. The logging road leading to it was rough and overgrown, barely more than a set of tire tracks winding through the woods. Our vehicle at the time didn't have four-wheel drive, so we had to park a ways back and haul all our gear in by foot. It was a pain, but the location was worth it. The ponds were alive with noise. Thousands of frogs filled the air with their calls, croaking in a constant, overlapping rhythm. It was the kind of sound that should have been annoying, but instead it felt peaceful, like white noise in the background, steady and comforting. I had never heard so many frogs in one place before. At night, their calls mixed with the distant hoots of owls and the occasional rustling of animals moving through the brush. We spent the evening setting up camp, gathering firewood, and cooking dinner. The fire crackled as we sat around it, enjoying the cool air and the stillness of the woods around us. The sky was clear, and when the moon rose, it reflected off the still water of the ponds, turning them into silver mirrors. Everything felt perfect. That feeling didn't last. At around 2 a.m, I woke up to the sound of engines. Not the distant hum of a car on a far-off road, but something much closer, deep, growling engines rumbling through the trees. I sat up in my sleeping bag, my heart hammering. The sound got louder, closer, and then suddenly, two massive black trucks came barreling down the overgrown path we had hiked in on. They didn't slow down as they hit the rough terrain. The branches and brush that had made our hike difficult barely seemed to register to them. They drove straight through the undergrowth like it wasn't even there, bouncing over fallen logs and small hills. The trucks didn't have their headlights on. In the darkness, they were just hulking, moving shadows, their outlines barely visible against the trees. I expected them to stop when they saw our tents. I expected someone to get out, maybe apologize for stumbling onto our campsite, maybe explain what they were doing there so late at night. But they didn't. The trucks rolled to a stop just a few yards from our tents, engines idling. The doors swung open, and people started piling out, way more than should have fit inside. It was like a clown car, one after another, all men, all moving with quiet purpose. None of them spoke. None of them laughed or joked. They didn't even acknowledge us. They carried nets. Without a word, they spread out, wading into the ponds, sweeping their nets through the water. The sound of the frogs had masked the noise of the trucks at first, but now, something strange was happening. The closer the men got, the quieter the frogs became. The calls thinned, then faded, then stopped completely. I sat frozen in my sleeping bag, watching. No one in my family spoke. We just stared, unsure of what was happening. The men moved with eerie precision, dragging their nets through the water, pulling in frogs by the dozens, scooping them up and tossing them into containers in the backs of the trucks. They worked quickly, efficiently, their movements almost robotic. They didn't speak. They didn't react to our presence. They didn't use flashlights. They didn't need them. For over an hour, they continued their silent harvesting. The ponds, which had been alive with noise when we arrived, were now deathly still. The air felt heavy, unnatural. It was like the entire forest was holding its breath. Then, just as suddenly as they had arrived, they were gone. The last of the men climbed back into the trucks, slamming the doors shut. The engines roared to life, and the vehicles backed up, turned around, and vanished down the path, swallowed by the darkness. We sat in silence for a long time after that, listening to the empty night. The frogs didn't start back up. The woods felt different now, like something had been taken from them. The next morning, we found one survivor. A single frog, barely alive, one of its legs injured. We picked it up carefully and carried it back to the pond, setting it in the water. It floated there for a moment, stunned, then weakly kicked away. The silence remained. We stayed for 2 more nights, but the ponds never recovered. The air, once filled with the chaotic symphony of frogs, remained empty. We had never realized how much their calls had shaped the atmosphere of the place until they were gone. Now the nights were too quiet. The woods felt hollow. We never saw the frog hunters again. We camped at that spot a few more times over the years, but the ponds never returned to what they had been before. The frogs never came back in full force. Whatever had happened that night, whatever those men had done, it had changed something. The following year, we camped in a different part of the park. No strange trucks, no silent hunters, just us, the woods, and the usual sounds of nature. But that trip had its own problems. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, we woke to the sound of something moving outside our tents. Something big. At first, we thought it was another late-night visitor, but when we unzipped the tent flap, we saw it. A black bear, casually dragging off our cooler. Someone had left the lid unlatched, and an open pack of marshmallows had been inside. The bear had zeroed in on the scent, helped itself to our food, and was now waddling off into the trees, our cooler bouncing along behind it. We watched as it disappeared into the woods, then spent the rest of the night listening for it to come back. It didn't. In the morning, we found the cooler a little ways from camp. The marshmallows were gone, and a few of our beer cans had been crushed, but the bear had left the rest alone. That incident didn't shake me nearly as much as the frog hunters had. The bear was just doing what bears do, looking for food, taking an easy meal when it found one. It wasn't strange. It wasn't unnatural. But the men in the trucks, they were different. Years later, I still don't have an explanation for them. Maybe they were gathering frogs for food, though frog legs aren't exactly a popular dish around here. Maybe they were selling them. Maybe it was something else entirely. I don't know. What I do know is that I've never seen anyone move through the woods like that. Never seen people work in such perfect silence, such eerie coordination. And I've never heard the ponds sound the same since. I worked in Yellowstone for a summer, a job that was both beautiful and exhausting. Long shifts, unpredictable weather, and the sheer vastness of the park made every day an adventure. It was back when cell service was almost non-existent in the park, and if you needed help, you had to find a ranger station, a pay phone, or flag someone down. That night, I was coming back into the park late after a supply run to a nearby town. The road was empty, the kind of darkness you only get in places that are far from cities. The stars were bright, scattered across the sky in a way that felt unreal. My headlights cut through the night, illuminating the tall trees and the occasional reflectors along the road. Driving in Yellowstone at night always made me a little uneasy. Not because I was afraid of people or anything supernatural, just the sheer wildness of it. The deep, endless forest stretching on either side of the road, the knowledge that grizzlies, wolves, and mountain lions were out there somewhere, moving through the dark. There were places in the park where you could break down and not see another person for hours. Even on the main roads, traffic thinned out late at night. I was about 15 miles from my destination, winding along a road that cut through open meadows and patches of thick forest, when I saw something up ahead. A shape in the road, large and unmoving. As I got closer, my stomach dropped. A car, stopped in the middle of the lane, its headlights still on. And in front of it, a bison, massive, dark, and lying in the road. The animal was still alive. I could see its breath in the cold air, its body twitching, legs occasionally shifting like it was trying to move but couldn't. The impact must have broken something inside it. Bison are built like tanks, and hitting one at full speed would be like hitting a brick wall. The front end of the car was crumpled inward, the hood bent, windshield shattered. Steam poured from the engine. I slowed down, my heart hammering. I expected to see the driver standing nearby, maybe waving me down for help. But there was no one. The driver's door was open, the interior light spilling out onto the road. The car was still running, the radio playing some faint, tinny song. But the driver was gone. I sat there for a moment, gripping the wheel, trying to make sense of it. Maybe they had walked to find help. But where? There were no buildings, no lights, no trails leading away from the road. Just the open land, the trees, and the dark. I rolled forward slowly, my headlights sweeping the area, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. Just the wrecked car, the dying bison, and the cold silence of the night. I turned my high beams on and looked toward the tree line. No movement. No figures. If they had walked off, where had they gone? A more unsettling thought crept into my mind. What if they hadn't just walked away? What if they were injured, lying in the grass somewhere unconscious, bleeding out in the dark? I felt the weight of the isolation pressing in. I was the only person here, the only one who could do anything. But what could I do? I had no cell service. I didn't have a radio. I could stop and search the area, but the idea of stepping out into the darkness, knowing something could be watching from the trees, sent a deep chill through me. I decided the best thing to do was drive until I found help. There was a campground about 15 minutes ahead that I knew had a pay phone. That was my best option. As I started driving past the wreck, I glanced into the car. The interior light was still on, illuminating the empty front seat. There was no blood, no sign of a struggle, just an open bag of snacks on the passenger seat, a half-empty water bottle, and the cup holder. It looked like someone had just been there, just gotten out. I pressed the gas and picked up speed. The road stretched ahead, empty and dark, my headlights cutting through the blackness. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe they had been picked up by another car, a passing stranger who had taken them to get help. Maybe they had panicked and wandered into the trees, hoping to find a ranger station. But I couldn't shake the image of someone out there, stumbling through the wild, injured and alone. I reached the campground after what felt like an eternity. It was mostly quiet, a few dim lights glowing from RVs and tents. I pulled up near the entrance, where an old pay phone stood beside a wooden information board. I got out and grabbed the receiver, my hands shaking slightly. The metal felt cold, the kind of cold that sinks into your fingers. I dialed 911, the only number I knew would get a response. It rang. A dispatcher answered, and I told them what I had seen: the wrecked car, the bison, the missing driver. They asked for details, my location, what the car looked like. I gave them everything I could remember. "We'll send someone out," the dispatcher said. I stood there for a moment after hanging up, staring at the road I had just come down. It was still empty. No headlights, no movement. Just that deep, unbroken black. I didn't know what else to do, so I got back in my car and drove the rest of the way to my cabin. Sleep didn't come easily that night. I kept thinking about the wreck, the open door, the missing driver. The next day, I asked around. A ranger I knew said they had found the car, but not the driver, at least not at first. It took them a while, but eventually, they found a set of tracks leading off the road and into the grass. About a quarter-mile away, near a small cluster of trees, they found him. He had been alive when they got there, but severely disoriented, dehydrated, and suffering from a head injury. He had been trying to walk for help, but had no idea where he was going. If I hadn't called it in, he might not have made it through the night. The bison didn't survive. They had to put it down the next morning. I never forgot that night. The way the car just sat there, still running, still lit up like someone should have been inside. The massive shape of the bison in the road, its breath still rising in the cold air. The empty silence of the wilderness. It reminded me of how easy it is to disappear out there, how small we are in a place like Yellowstone, how quickly something can go wrong, and how alone you can find yourself when it does. Camping in the backcountry is second nature to me. I've spent years trekking through Colorado and Utah, pitching tents in places most people wouldn't dare sleep. My buddy and I weren't new to this. We knew what we were doing, but some places just feel off. It was late in the season, and most of the designated campgrounds in Poudre Canyon were closed. That didn't bother us. We had no problem finding our own spot off some random forest road. The kind of place where you have to trust your gut, where cell service drops off within minutes, where the only sounds at night are wind in the trees and whatever moves in the underbrush. We found a pull-off that looked promising, flat ground, enough space for a tent, and a thick tree line offering some wind protection. It felt normal enough at first, but within minutes of stepping out of the truck, things started to feel wrong. The first thing we found was a blanket wrapped around something near the tree line. It was matted, dirty, and bunched up like someone had abandoned it. Curiosity got the better of us. Lifting the edge revealed what was inside: bones. The remains of an animal, mostly skeletal, curled up inside the old blanket. It was hard to tell what it had been. Maybe a dog, maybe something else. The head was missing. We weren't exactly squeamish, but this set an immediate tone. Someone had wrapped this animal up and left it here. That meant human hands had done this. But why? And why here? We shook it off. Maybe someone's pet had died, and they didn't have the heart to bury it properly. Maybe a hunter had left it behind, though I couldn't imagine why. Either way, we weren't about to let it ruin our night. After setting up camp, we decided to explore. The sun was starting to dip, so we kept our hike short. We climbed a few ridges, trying to get a better view of the land. That's when we found the tent. It was wrapped around a tree. Not set up on the ground like someone had camped there, wrapped. Tattered fabric flapped in the breeze, and the poles stuck out in odd angles, twisted and broken. I was certain we were going to find a body inside. We approached cautiously, hearts hammering, the quiet pressing down on us. There was no smell, no obvious sign of decay, but something about the tent was deeply unsettling. It didn't make sense for it to be in a tree like that. Had it been left behind? Had someone tried to use it for shelter and then abandoned it? I forced myself to look inside. Notebooks, dozens of them, scattered in a mess alongside an old sleeping bag. The pages were warped from weather, some ripped, others barely holding together. I flipped one open. No names, no dates, just words, scribbled in frantic, messy handwriting. Some pages were filled with nonsense, just repeated sentences over and over again. Others had rough sketches of trees, mountains, eyes. Something about it felt deeply personal, and deeply wrong. Neither of us spoke. We backed away, left the tent as we found it, and started our way down the ridge. The slope was steep, forcing us to move carefully. Loose dirt and rocks shifted beneath our boots. Halfway down, the wind changed, carrying something sharp and rancid with it. The unmistakable smell of death. I've smelled it before, something dead and fresh, the sickly sweet rot of decay. It hit us like a wall, heavy and lingering. We stopped. Nestled against a tree, a small towel was bundled up tightly, something inside pressing against the fabric. I didn't want to look. Every instinct told me to leave it alone, but my buddy took a step forward. We both stared at it, the placement deliberate, as if someone had carefully chosen that exact spot. This wasn't an animal that had died naturally. Someone had put it there. We left it. There was nothing else to do. We climbed down the rest of the hill in silence, feeling watched even though we never saw anyone. Back at camp, we didn't talk about what we'd seen. Instead, we did what any experienced camper does in an uncomfortable situation. We built a fire, poured bourbon, and tried to let the warmth of both settle us. But it didn't work. After a few drinks, we made a decision. We needed to know what was in that towel. The climb back up was worse in the dark. Every sound felt amplified. The wind through the trees, the crunch of our boots on dry earth, the occasional snap of a branch somewhere off in the distance. When we reached the tree, the smell was stronger. I grabbed a stick, hesitated, then pushed the towel open. A dead owl. Fresh. Its body was still intact, feathers ruffled, but not yet stiff with rigor mortis. Its wings were tucked unnaturally close to its body, and its head lolled to the side. Someone had killed this bird, wrapped it up, carried it up a steep incline, and carefully placed it against a tree. Why? Why an owl? Why go through the effort of hiking up here to leave it like this? Something in my gut told me we needed to leave. Not in the morning. Now, we scrambled back down to camp, moving fast, the firelight flickering ahead of us. Neither of us slept that night. Every sound outside the tent made my skin crawl. A twig snapping, leaves rustling, the wind shifting through the trees. By the time the sun crept over the horizon, we were already packing. The drive back felt longer than it should have. The roads winding through the canyon seemed darker, the trees pressing in closer. Neither of us spoke much, but we both felt it. That place wasn't normal. I've camped in strange places before. I've found old, forgotten things in the woods, abandoned campsites, rusted out cars, even bones. But nothing like that. Nothing with that kind of intent. Someone had been there before us. And whatever they were doing, we wanted no part of it. The sun was already beginning to dip behind the trees as we wound our way through the dense, green depths of Olympic National Park. The old forest road was narrow, barely wide enough for my car, and uneven from years of rain and fallen debris. The air smelled of damp earth and cedar, thick and heavy in the evening warmth. This was the start of something we had been planning for months. A week-long backpacking trip deep into the western side of the park, where the trails were less traveled and the wilderness still felt untouched. I was at the wheel, keeping a steady speed of around 25 to 30 miles per hour, my tires crunching over loose gravel and the occasional pothole. The windows were cracked open, letting in the crisp, pine-scented breeze. My two buddies sat beside and behind me, our packs crammed into the back of the car, stuffed with everything we would need for the next 7 days. It was the last bit of civilization we'd see before stepping into the deep woods. The road stretched ahead, winding slightly, the towering Douglas firs casting long shadows across the dirt. Everything felt calm, just another drive through the Pacific Northwest wilderness. Then, out of nowhere, the underbrush to my right exploded. A massive shape burst from the dense green foliage, a black blur moving with terrifying speed. It took my brain a second to process what I was seeing. One moment, the road was empty. The next, a black bear, easily 300 pounds, was launching itself out of the woods and directly into my path. My foot hesitated on the brake, instinct battling logic. The bear's momentum was incredible. It didn't even pause as it hit the road, its thick paws slamming against the gravel with enough force to send up small clouds of dust. For the briefest moment, I thought we were going to collide. My hands tightened on the wheel, my pulse spiking. But then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it swerved. The bear veered away from my car, cutting sharply left, its body twisting with an agility that seemed impossible for something that size. Instead of continuing across the road, it turned up it. And then, like something out of a nightmare, it ran. Not just ran, it accelerated. My foot barely had time to react, barely had time to ease off the gas before it was already putting distance between us. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The bear moved like a thoroughbred horse, its powerful muscles rippling beneath thick fur, claws tearing at the gravel as it charged forward. It wasn't running away in a panic. It wasn't stumbling or hesitating. It owned that road, covering ground like an animal that had never once doubted its ability to outrun anything behind it. It was faster than my car. My speedometer hovered between 25 and 30 miles per hour, and the bear was pulling away. My heart pounded against my ribs, my hands locked on the wheel as my brain tried to catch up with reality. I had always known black bears could run. On paper, sure, I'd heard they could reach speeds of 30 miles per hour. But knowing something in theory and seeing it with your own eyes were two very different things. I could see the muscles in its shoulders flexing with each bound. It was effortless, like it was built for this. A full-grown bear, easily 300 pounds, was moving like a machine, eating up the distance ahead with terrifying ease. And then it looked back at me. I will never forget that moment. The bear turned its massive head over its shoulder mid-stride, its small dark eyes locking onto mine through the windshield. It wasn't a look of fear. It wasn't panic or desperation. It was calculated. It looked at me the way an Olympic sprinter might glance at a competitor falling behind, as if to say, asterisk, you will never catch me, asterisk. And then, with one final bound, it disappeared. The bear veered hard left and launched itself back into the underbrush. 1 second it was there. The next, the forest had swallowed it whole, the only trace of its passing the faint rustling of disturbed branches. The road was empty again. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. My knuckles were white against the wheel. For a long moment, none of us spoke. The engine hummed softly, the tires crunching over loose gravel, the evening air thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. It was as if the entire forest had fallen silent, holding its breath just as we had. Then, finally, I slowed the car, easing my foot off the gas completely. My body felt strange, like it hadn't quite processed what had just happened. My pulse still pounded in my ears, adrenaline still humming through my veins. I turned my head slightly, glancing at my rearview mirror. The road behind us was empty, the forest dark and still. It didn't matter. The bear was gone, and it had won. The reality was undeniable. If that bear had wanted to, it could have closed the distance between us in seconds. If I had been on foot, there would have been no contest. There's a lot of misinformation about black bears. People say they're slow, that they'll run up trees rather than chase you down, that you can outrun them. I had just seen with my own 2 eyes that it was all bullshit. Bears are fast. They are powerful. And in the wild, they do not hesitate. The rest of our drive to the campsite was quiet. I kept my hands on the wheel, my mind replaying the moment over and over, the sight of that massive black bear cutting up the road with the kind of effortless speed that no human could ever hope to match. We set up camp as the last light faded, the sounds of the forest creeping back to life. The hoot of an owl, the distant rustle of branches, the wind moving through the pines. We hadn't even stepped onto the trail yet, and already the wilderness had made its point. It didn't matter how prepared we thought we were. Out here, we were slow. Out here, we were small. And out here, we would never, ever outrun a bear. I don't remember my mother's face, not truly. I've seen the old photographs, but they are black and white, stiff, lifeless. A young woman with dark hair, caught in time, her smile faded by the years. They say I was 3 when she died. 3 is old enough to understand something is wrong, but too young to stop it. Old enough to remember things in pieces, but too young for anyone to believe me. I can still see the door. It was a heavy thing, thick wood with a brass handle, worn from years of my father coming home from the mill, my mother wiping her hands on her apron before turning it open. I remember standing behind her that day, gripping the back of her skirt, feeling the fabric twist in my fingers. I was always hiding behind her back, pressing into her warmth, listening to the sound of her voice. She smelled like flour and lye soap. Her hands were always busy, kneading dough, braiding my hair, tucking blankets around me at night. And then the door opened. Lorraine was standing there. Her hat was tilted just so, her coat buttoned high against her neck, the way women dressed when they wanted to look put together but were holding something back. I remember how still my mother went, like she had suddenly forgotten how to move. I was 3. I didn't know what a gun was. I only knew that something terrible was happening. My mother was in front of me, and then she wasn't. There was a sound, loud, wrong, unlike anything I had ever heard before. My mother jerked forward, and then crumpled. One moment she was standing, solid and warm, and the next she was on the floor, her body twisted in a way that made no sense. Her hands, always so full of life, twitched once, then stopped moving. I didn't scream. I should have, but I didn't. I don't know if it was shock, or if something deep inside me already knew that making a sound would be the end of me too. I remember staring at her, at the bright, wet mess spreading across the floor, seeping into the cracks in the wood. It smelled sharp like pennies. Lorraine was looking at me. She hadn't expected me to be there. That much I understood, even at 3. Her eyes flicked down to me, wide, calculating. I don't know what she was thinking. Maybe she thought I wouldn't remember. Maybe she knew no one would believe a child. Or maybe she just couldn't do it, couldn't shoot a child, despite everything. She left. Just like that. She stepped over my mother's body, shut the door behind her, and left. I didn't move for a long time. The house was silent, except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. The smell of blood filled my nose, thick and metallic, and I couldn't understand why my mother wasn't getting up. I tried to shake her, but her body was already cooling. By the time they found us, I had curled up beside her, my hands sticky from where I had tried to wake her up. The neighbors came running when my father arrived home and started screaming. He lifted me up, but I wouldn't let go of my mother's dress, my fingers tangled in the fabric. They had to pry me away. I don't remember the funeral. I don't remember what they told me, only that everyone talked in hushed voices, and when I said the lady at the door did it, they just patted my head and told me I must have been very confused. A child doesn't understand how little they matter until no one listens. Time passed, and the world kept moving like nothing had happened. People whispered about it, of course. A woman shot dead in her own home. How could they not? But the police found nothing. No weapon, no footprints, no witnesses aside from a little girl with an overactive imagination. It was 1930. There were no cameras, no forensic science like they have now. If someone didn't confess, if there wasn't a clear suspect, the case just went cold. And then Lorraine came back. At first, it was little things. I would see her in town, dressed neatly, talking to my father. I was a child, but I wasn't stupid. I saw the way she looked at him, the way her lips curved when he wasn't looking. People talked, but no one said anything outright. A man needs a woman in his home, they said. A little girl can't grow up without a mother. They never asked if I wanted a new mother. One day, she moved in. Just like that. She brought her 2 children from her first marriage, a boy and a girl, both older than me. They had nice clothes, well-brushed hair. They always seemed to have more food on their plates, while I was told not to be greedy. I was the odd one out in my own home. Lorraine never raised a hand to me. Not once. That would have been too obvious. She didn't have to hit me to make my life miserable. She ignored me when my father was around, but when we were alone, she would smile, lean close, and whisper things only I could hear. No one believes you. No one will ever believe you. You don't matter. When I cried at night, she would walk past my door, humming to herself, like she was the happiest woman in the world. Her children took after her. They knew I was different, knew I didn't belong. If my clothes went missing, they were the ones who took them. If my food disappeared from my plate, they were the ones who had it. But no one ever saw, no one ever noticed. And when I finally worked up the courage to say something, my father's face went tight, like he didn't want to hear it. Lorraine just smiled. I left as soon as I could. Married young, moved out, started a family of my own. But the past doesn't leave you, not really. The memories stayed in my bones, in the quiet moments when I was alone, in the way I still flinched at the sound of a door opening. And then, years later, when Lorraine was old and dying, she finally spoke. She told them everything. How she had waited until my father was at work, how she had walked up to the house, how she had knocked on the door and shot my mother in the chest, how she had stepped over her body, closed the door, and walked away. 57 years too late. My father was already gone by then. He never knew. He died believing a lie, believing that his first wife had been taken by some nameless stranger, that his second wife had saved him from loneliness. And even after Lorraine confessed, nothing changed. The law doesn't care about the confessions of a dying woman, not when she's already at death's door. No case reopened, no justice served. Nothing written down in the records to say what she did. The world had moved on. The law had moved on. But I never did. I grew up in a house with my mother's murderer. I ate meals with her, lived under her roof, was raised under her rules. And when I tried to tell the truth, no one listened. Even as an adult, even when I had my own children, they would shake their heads, say I was just a child when it happened, that I must have misremembered. But I never forgot. I still remember the sound, the way my mother's body fell, the way Lorraine looked at me, just for a moment, deciding. I remember everything. I was 8 or 9 the first time it happened. too young to understand what I had really found, but old enough for it to change something in me. My mom used to make baskets and crafts from natural materials, and she'd take me along when she went out gathering. It was something we did together, though I think she mostly brought me along to keep an eye on me. I liked being out in the woods, but I was always the type to wander off a little. Not far enough to get lost, just far enough to feel like I was alone. This time, we were at a reservoir near what I think was a national park. I don't remember exactly where. It was the early 90s, before cell phones, before everything had a digital record. I just know it was a big body of water, surrounded by forest, with a rocky shore where people fished and swam in the summer. I had a bag and a little woven basket, the kind my mom made, and I was picking up trash along the shoreline. She paid me a nickel for every piece I found, so I took it seriously. Some old habits die hard. I still catch myself picking up trash sometimes, even when no one's paying me. The water was still that day. Not glassy, just heavy looking, like the kind of water that doesn't want to be disturbed. There was a slight smell to it, not rotten, just that thick, damp scent of lake water and wet earth. I saw what I thought was a glove near the edge of the water. A work glove, maybe, or one of those brown leather ones people use for yard work. It was curled up, fingers stiff and slightly bent, and I figured the water had washed it up. I reached down and grabbed it. The moment my fingers closed around it, I knew something was wrong. The texture was all off, too thick, too rubbery. The weight was wrong, too. A glove should have been light, but this had heft. It wasn't soaking wet like I expected, but damp, and where my fingers pressed into it, the surface didn't give like fabric or leather. Then I saw the wrist. A few inches past where the glove should have ended, the flesh was jagged and pale. It wasn't cleanly cut, more like something had ripped it away. The bone was visible, but softened somehow, like the water had been working on it. It wasn't a glove. It was a hand. I started screaming. I don't even remember deciding to scream. It just happened. My body locked up, but my fingers wouldn't let go. I tried to drop it, but my hand wouldn't work. I don't know how long I stood there, holding on to that thing, but at some point, my mom came running. I barely remember her face, just the feeling of her hands prying mine open, forcing me to let go. After that, everything blurred. She dragged me back to the car, half carrying me, because my legs wouldn't work right. I was crying, but not the normal kind of crying. It was this thin, gasping sound, like I couldn't get enough air. We had to drive to the nearest gas station to call the cops. The payphone was sticky, and the whole place smelled like old beer and gasoline. The clerk gave me a candy bar, but I couldn't eat it. The police came and went out to get the hand. They told my mom it was probably from a bear, something to calm me down, but I could tell they didn't believe it. I heard later that some teenagers had been drinking on a powerboat and one of them fell in. The propeller got him. I had found what was left. I didn't talk for 2 months after that. It's not like I refused. It just stopped coming out. I'd try to say something, and nothing would happen. My throat would close up, my mind would go blank. It took me years to be okay with seeing dead things, and even now, if something is too fresh, too close to that color, that texture, I feel it all over again. I thought that would be the worst thing I'd ever find. But years later, I found something else. Hashtag the bone altar. I was in college when I went on that last camping trip. It had been a rough semester, the kind that made me want to be alone for a while. I packed up my gear, drove out to the mountains, and started hiking. I didn't have a real plan, just a vague idea of where I wanted to end up, somewhere in southwestern Colorado. For the first day, everything was fine. It was quiet, peaceful. The kind of silence that feels like a weight lifting off your chest. I followed the trails, set up camp in a good spot, and slept better than I had in months. The second day, I was heading back toward my car when I heard voices coming up the trail behind me. A group of hikers, probably, but I wasn't in the mood for people. I stepped off the path, planning to cut through the woods and meet up with the trail further down. That was my mistake. The trees got thicker the further I went. At first, it was just a little overgrown, but then the branches started closing in. The ground turned uneven, roots twisting up from the dirt like bones under skin. It should have felt normal, just a dense part of the forest, but something about it felt wrong. I don't know how to explain it. The air was different, heavy in a way that made my stomach knot up. It was too quiet. No birds, no wind in the leaves. Just the sound of my own breathing. Then I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a pile of bones. Maybe a hunter's leftovers, maybe something a predator had dragged together. But as I got closer, I saw the shape of it. It wasn't just a pile. It was arranged. A table almost made entirely of bones. Some were small, ribs, spines, pieces of birds or rabbits, but others were bigger. A deer skull sat at the center, its antlers tangled with bits of wire and rusted metal. Strings of bones hung from the trees around it, swaying slightly even though there was no wind. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I felt that same tightness in my chest that I had felt at the reservoir. That same sick realization that I had stepped into something I shouldn't have. I backed away slowly. Then I turned and ran. I don't remember the way back to the trail. I just remember branches slapping my face, roots catching at my boots. My pack got snagged on something, and I nearly went down, but I yanked free and kept going. I didn't stop until I was back at my car. I threw my gear in the trunk, got in, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the keys in the ignition. When the engine finally turned over, I peeled out so fast that gravel sprayed against the trees. I didn't look back. I never went camping again. I don't know who built that thing, and I don't want to know. Some things are better left undiscovered. I used to think I could read people. I thought I had a good sense of when someone was off, when something wasn't right. But I was wrong. A year ago, I lived next to a man who kidnapped and murdered a 6-year-old girl. A man I had spoken to, who had seen me go in and out of my townhouse, who had probably watched me dozens of times without me ever knowing. A man who went to bed one night after taking the life of a child and woke up the next day like it was nothing. I still think about that all the time. How close I was. How easy it would have been for me or my fiancée to be another one of his victims. How I never knew I was living next to a monster. It all started when the news broke that Faye Sweatlick was missing. She was 6 years old, vanished right from her front yard in broad daylight. It was all over the news within hours. Amber alerts, police statements, neighbors being interviewed. Her face was on every screen, her name on every radio station. She lived close by, not far from my townhouse complex. The police presence in the area doubled overnight. Cops were everywhere, patrolling, knocking on doors, stopping people in the streets to ask if they had seen anything. I remember the first time I saw her picture. She had this bright, innocent smile, like any little kid. Happy, carefree. It didn't seem real that she was just gone. My fiancé and I weren't paying much attention at first. We saw the news, sure. It was terrible, but at the time, it didn't feel personal. Just another horrible thing happening somewhere else. Then the cops showed up at our townhouse complex. I looked outside, and the parking lot was filled with police cars. Officers were going door to door, asking people if they had seen anything, if they had security cameras, if they knew anything at all that could help. That was the first time I felt uneasy about the whole thing. Because when the police start searching your neighborhood for a missing girl, it doesn't feel like some distant tragedy anymore. It feels close, too close, and it only got worse from there. The first time we met with the FBI, I wasn't nervous. At least, not in the way you'd expect. They were interviewing everyone in the complex, asking about our routines, if we had seen anything out of the ordinary. My fiancé and I sat at our kitchen table while 2 agents asked us questions, taking notes on their little notepads. Did we know our neighbors well? Had we noticed any unusual activity in the past few days? Did we have any security cameras? Had we ever seen Faye in the area? We answered as best we could, but the truth was we didn't know much. We kept to ourselves. We knew some of our neighbors in passing, nodding at them when we passed in the parking lot, holding the door open if we happened to be going in at the same time. But that was it. The second time the FBI came, they searched our house. That made me nervous. Even though we had nothing to hide, there's something about law enforcement searching your home that makes you feel guilty, like you're under suspicion even when you've done nothing wrong. They went through every room, every closet, even our fridge. They checked under our bed, in our storage closet, in the trunk of our car. They were looking for anything. A piece of evidence. A clue. A reason to believe that Faye had been in our townhouse. Of course, they found nothing. The third time, they just asked more questions. Did we remember anything new? Had we seen anything strange? Did anyone in the complex seem nervous, scared, like they were hiding something? We told them no, and we meant it, because at the time, we had no idea that the man they were looking for was living right next door. The day they found her body is burned into my memory. I can still see it, Still hear it, like it's playing on a loop in the back of my mind. I was at work when my fiancée FaceTimed me. Her voice was shaking. I could barely hear her over the background noise. Police sirens, walkie-talkies crackling, the hum of a news helicopter overhead. They're digging through the trash cans outside. I sat up straight. What? Who is? The cops. The FBI. Everyone. They're right in front of our townhouse. She flipped the camera, and I saw them. Officers in gloves, sifting through garbage. Agents standing nearby, watching closely. People whispering to each other, their faces grim. Then, suddenly, everything changed. One of the cops pulled something out of the trash bag. He held it up, and I saw it through my fiancée's phone screen. A little girl's boot. Then another officer found a knife. Bloodied, wrapped in garbage. A murder weapon, thrown away like trash. I felt sick. My fiancée was still whispering, but I barely heard her. I was too focused on the scene unfolding outside our home. The cops weren't moving like they had been before. Now they were frantic. Radios buzzing. People running. They knew. They knew they had found what they were looking for. Minutes later, they found her body. She had been dumped in a wooded area behind the complex. Maybe 300 feet from where I slept at night. Where I ate dinner. Where I locked my door, thinking I was safe. And the man who did it, my neighbor, the guy I had talked to, had watched the whole thing happen. He had watched from his townhouse window as the police found the evidence. He had seen them pull Faye's boot from the trash, watched them realize they were closing in on him. And then, before they could even knock on his door, he stepped out onto his back porch, took a knife, and cut his own throat. By the time the cops reached him, he was dead. It didn't feel real at first. The whole complex was on lockdown. News vans swarmed the parking lot. Reporters shoved microphones in people's faces, asking how they felt about living next to a killer. I watched it all in a daze, standing in my doorway, wondering how I had lived next to a murderer without ever knowing it. The worst part was remembering the small interactions I'd had with him. Had I ever shaken his hand? Had we ever held the front door open for each other? Had I ever smiled at him, nodded, said hello? Had I ever let my guard down around a man who was capable of killing a child? It haunts me. The what-ifs. The could-have-beens. What if the cops had never checked the trash? What if they had never found the boot, the knife? Would he have gone on like nothing happened? Would he have done it again? I don't live in that townhouse anymore. My fiancée and I moved as soon as we could. We packed up and left, not even looking back. I couldn't stand being there. Couldn't sleep knowing what had happened so close. Sometimes, though, I still think about him. My neighbor, the murderer. And I wonder how many other people in the world are just like him, hiding in plain sight. I had been working as a wetland biologist in Pennsylvania for a few years, spending most of my time hiking through thick brush, tracing the slow, creeping expansion of wetlands, flagging boundaries, and mapping out where the water moved underground. It was quiet, often monotonous work, but I liked it. The solitude of the job suited me. I didn't mind long days in the woods, miles away from the nearest road, tracking water flows and marking restoration sites. This site was no different. Just another stretch of public land undergoing restoration, thick with old-growth trees and tangled underbrush, tucked away at the base of a mountain. It had once been farmland, long before the state took it over. A few traces of that past still lingered, half-buried fence posts, crumbling stone walls, an old reservoir that was slowly being reclaimed by the wetlands around it. That's where I was, making my way up the hill, tracing the sources of the springs and seeps that fed the reservoir below. The hike had been slow going. The hill was steep, and the forest here was dense. Every few steps, I had to push through thick branches or wade through knee-deep patches of ferns. My boots sank slightly into the damp soil, and I had to be careful not to slip. Every so often, I paused to make notes, mark my GPS, flag boundaries. Standard routine. It was quiet out here. Not eerily quiet, but the kind of stillness you only get in deep woods. No hum of traffic, no distant human voices. Just the wind moving through the trees, the occasional bird call, and the sound of water trickling through the underbrush. Then I crested the hill, and that's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just another old hunting camp, maybe a squatter's hideout. The woods here were filled with remnants of the past, abandoned farmsteads, forgotten logging sites, old hunting camps slowly rotting into the earth. But this one felt different. The clearing was littered with rusted-out furniture, An old refrigerator, its door hanging open and lined with black mold, crushed beer cans, empty chewing tobacco tins. A few weathered folding chairs sat in a rough circle, one of them overturned. There was a fire pit long cold, filled with the remains of burnt wood and soggy debris. Cans of Natty Light lay scattered around, their blue labels faded from the sun. The place had been abandoned for a while, but not too long. Something about it put me on edge. Maybe it was the way the furniture was arranged, like people had just been here, but were suddenly gone. Maybe it was the half-buried trash, the way it seemed like whoever had been here wasn't planning on leaving for good. I wasn't sure, but I didn't linger. I had work to do, and I wasn't about to spend any more time than necessary picking through someone's abandoned camp. I turned around, ready to head back down. That's when I saw the dog, a German shepherd, big, well-fed, and perfectly clean, not the kind of stray you usually find wandering through the woods. It stood at the edge of the clearing, watching me. Its ears were up, its eyes alert, but it didn't growl or show any aggression. My first thought was that I was in trouble. A stray dog this size could do some damage if it decided I was a threat. I tightened my grip on my shovel handle, bracing myself in case it lunged. But the dog didn't move toward me. It just stood there, looking at me expectantly. Then it turned and started walking up the hill. It paused, glancing back, as if it wanted me to follow. For a second, I hesitated. This was stupid. I was alone 6 miles from the road, out of cell range, with no idea where this dog had come from. But something about the way it looked at me made me pause. Maybe someone was up there, someone in trouble. The dog didn't seem panicked, though. Just waiting. Against my better judgment, I followed. The climb got steeper as I moved past the clearing. The trees grew thicker, the undergrowth denser. The dog weaved ahead of me, moving with an easy confidence through the brush. I kept my eyes on it, watching the way its tail flicked, the way it stopped every so often to make sure I was keeping up. It led me up the hill for maybe 10 minutes, then the ground started leveling out. That's when I saw them. Dolls. Dozens of them, buried up to their necks in the soil. I stopped dead in my tracks. My stomach clenched, a slow, twisting unease spreading through me. They were old, dirty, ratty things with sun-bleached faces and tangled hair. Some had missing eyes, others had cracked plastic cheeks. Their arms were sticking straight up, fingers outstretched, like they were reaching for something. Or pointing. I followed their hands. A deer carcass dangled from the branches ahead, twisted up in the limbs of a tree. I felt something cold settle in my chest. The deer had been there for a while, long enough for the body to start breaking down, for the skin to sag and pull away from the bone. But there was something about the way it was hanging that felt wrong. It wasn't just caught in the branches. It had been tied there. I took a slow step back. The dog was staring at me now, its head tilted slightly. Something shifted in the trees. I didn't wait to find out what. I turned and walked. Not fast, just steady, even steps, back the way I had come. My heart was pounding, my throat dry. I didn't look back. Not at the dolls, not at the deer, not at the dog. The hike down felt twice as long as the way up. Every sound made my pulse jump, the crack of a branch, the rustling of leaves. The woods felt different now, heavier, like the trees were pressing in around me. I kept moving, past the camp, past the rusted-out furniture, back down the hill toward the reservoir. I didn't stop until I reached my truck. I yanked open the door, threw my gear in the passenger seat, and got inside, locking the doors out of instinct. I sat there for a long minute, gripping the steering wheel, trying to steady my breathing. My hands were shaking. I glanced back toward the woods. Nothing moved. No sign of the dog. No sign of anything. I started the truck and pulled onto the road. I was supposed to be back at this site in a few weeks. More surveys, more flagging, more mapping. I didn't care. I was getting married in a month. I wasn't about to spend my time hiking back up into those woods, into whatever the hell that was. The job was done. I was never going back. And I didn't. I was 16 this summer. My father shot my brother. It was one of those hot, sticky summers where the air barely moved, and everything smelled like dust, sweat, and old wood. I don't know if the heat made things worse, or if I just remember it that way, but I do know that by then, I had already learned to live in a constant state of waiting for the next outburst, the next unpredictable moment. That was just life in our house, like standing on cracked ice, always ready for it to give way beneath you. My father had never been a good man. That's not something I realized all at once, but something that had settled in over time, piece by piece. By 16, I understood it completely. The way he looked at people like they were only objects in his way. The way his moods shifted like an unpredictable storm. There were days when he was fine. Days when you could slip by unnoticed if you were careful enough. And then there were the other days. That summer, my brother and I were trying to make it through just like always. He was 13, smaller than me, quieter. He had learned early that silence was safer. But it didn't matter how quiet you were in that house. Nothing could keep you safe when the wrong switch flipped in my father's head. I don't know what happened before the shot. I wasn't there. I only know that at some point that day, my father stood in the basement with a shotgun in his hands, my brother standing just feet away. I don't know if there were words exchanged, if there was any warning, any sign that something was about to happen. I don't even know if my brother saw it coming. What I do know is that the shotgun fired. A 12 gauge at close range is not something you walk away from. Not normally. But somehow my brother did. The pellets tore through his chest, missing his heart by 2 inches. I have thought about those 2 inches so many times over the years. 2 inches is nothing. It's the space between life and death. The shot should have killed him. Maybe in my father's mind, it already had. Maybe he had expected to see my brother drop, see his body hit the basement floor, unmoving. But that's not what happened. I imagine there was silence at first, a moment where the world held its breath. The smoke clearing, my father standing there, still gripping the shotgun. My brother still standing too, or maybe he was already on the ground, gasping, blood spilling across the tile. Maybe he made a noise, maybe he didn't. But he lived. Somehow he lived. I didn't find out until later, when I walked through the front door and smelled something that wasn't quite right. The air inside felt thick, heavy, like a room that had been left without an open window for too long. And then I saw her, my stepmother. She was on her hands and knees in the basement, scrubbing the floor. I didn't see the blood at first. It had already been smeared into the tile, spread thin by the wet rag in her hand. She looked up when I walked in, but her expression didn't change. Just another chore, another thing to take care of before dinner. I don't remember if I said anything. I don't think I did. I just stood there, staring at the wet tile, at the pinkish streaks where the blood mixed with water. And then I looked up and saw the hole in the wall. The place where the shot had finally lodged itself after tearing through my brother's chest. There was no panic, no screaming, no flashing lights or sirens. No justice, no consequences. Just the quiet, just the sound of the rag against the tile. They said it was an accident. That's what my father told them. That's what the police chose to believe. And my brother and I, we were too afraid to say otherwise. What could we have said? That it wasn't an accident? That the man who had spent our whole lives scaring us, hurting us, had finally taken it a step further? That he had fired that gun and then sat there, watching, waiting to see if my brother would die. No one would have listened. So we said nothing. And life went on, like it always had. My brother survived. He spent days in the hospital, the doctors marveling at how close he had come to dying, at how lucky he was. That's what they called it, luck. 2 inches. That's what luck looks like. He came home eventually, and things were quiet, quieter than they had ever been. My father didn't mention it. My stepmother didn't mention it, and so we didn't either. But we felt it, hanging in the air like smoke that never quite cleared. I don't remember when my brother and I made the decision to leave. I think it had already been made, somewhere deep inside us, long before we actually packed our bags. There was no life left for us in that house. No future. Only the past, only the memories, only the knowledge that staying meant waiting for the next moment, the next shot. We left the day I turned 18. He was 15. There was no long goodbye, no dramatic confrontation. Just bags packed in the night, just the sound of the door closing behind us. We never went back, never spoke to him again. And my brother, he still carries it with him. The scars, the small pieces of metal still buried under his skin. Reminders of a day that should have been the last day of his life but wasn't. 2 inches. That's how close he came to dying. That's how close we came to never making it out at all. I've always been careful when I hike alone. You have to be, especially in a place like this. The jungle doesn't care about you. The mountains don't care about you. If you mess up, no one is coming to help. It doesn't matter if there are other hikers nearby or if you're on some well-worn trail. When things go wrong out here, they go wrong fast. It had rained the night before, and everything was wet. The kind of wet that lingers even after the sun comes up. The trees dripped, the air clung to my skin, and the ground was soft underfoot. Not quite mud, but close. I had been hiking all morning, moving slowly up a ridge, feeling the weight of the jungle pressing in from all sides. It wasn't the kind of place you could rush through. Roots snaked across the path, thick and gnarled, waiting to trip you. Every step had to be placed carefully, every movement deliberate. At some point, I wandered away from the other hikers. I didn't mean to. It wasn't like I was trying to get lost. I just saw a spot where the trees opened up a little, where the ground sloped downward in a way that looked interesting. It wasn't far, just a short detour. I stepped off the trail, moving carefully through the undergrowth, my boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. The ground was softer than I expected. I took one more step, and suddenly everything was gone. There was no warning, no sound, no chance to react. The earth simply vanished beneath me. One moment I was standing, and the next I was falling. I barely had time to register what was happening before I hit water. It wasn't just water. It was moving fast. Before I could even try to grab onto something, I was pulled under, dragged forward by an invisible force. The cold hit me like a shock, knocking the air from my lungs as I tumbled forward into total darkness. I didn't know what had happened. 1 second, I was hiking, and the next, I was drowning. The water spun me, flipped me, slammed me against the walls of something hard and unyielding. A tunnel. I had fallen into a tunnel. An underground river. There was no time to process it, no time to think. My body was no longer mine. It belonged to the current. It shoved me forward, smashing me against rock, dragging me down, pulling me deeper into the blackness. My arms flailed, trying to find something, anything, to hold on to. There was nothing, just water and stone. I hit something solid with my shoulder, pain exploding up my arm, and then I was tumbling again, rolling in the current like a piece of debris. My chest burned. I had taken in water when I fell, and my lungs screamed for air, but there was none. It was pure panic. No control. No sense of direction. Just a desperate, clawing need to breathe, to get out, to find the surface. But there was no surface. Only cold, moving water, and the black void stretching endlessly around me. I don't know how long it went on. Time lost meaning. The only thing that mattered was surviving the next second, and then the one after that. At some point, the current slowed. Not completely, but enough. I felt myself being pushed into something bigger, an open space. The water wasn't rushing as violently. I wasn't being slammed against rock anymore. I realized I could move, but I was still underwater. The panic was still there, but something cut through it, instinct. I forced myself to stop thrashing, to stop wasting energy. I needed to find a way out, and fast. I couldn't see anything, couldn't hear anything except the muted roar of water. But the water had to keep moving somewhere. It had brought me here, it had to keep flowing. I stretched my hands out, feeling blindly in the dark. The tunnel that had spat me out wasn't sucking me back in, which meant there had to be another way. Another tunnel, another opening. I reached forward, sweeping my arms through the freezing water. Nothing. My lungs burned. The tightness in my chest was unbearable. I pushed forward, blindly, my hands searching. And then I felt it, a current, a pull, a direction. I didn't hesitate. I let the water take me again. This time, I fought to stay in control. I didn't let it spin me. I kept my arms stretched forward, my legs kicking, forcing myself to follow the current rather than be thrown by it. The tunnel was tighter. I could feel the walls closing in around me. I scraped against rock, my skin tearing, but I didn't stop. I kept moving forward. The current was strong, but not as violent as before. It was guiding me. And then, suddenly light. Faint at first. A pinprick in the blackness. Then brighter. I surged toward it, every muscle screaming. The ceiling was close. I could feel it above me. A thin layer of earth. I reached up, my fingers pressing against it. Packed dirt. Soft. Breakable. I punched. Nothing. I punched again, harder. The ground gave way. I felt my hand break through to the surface. Air. I clawed at the opening, forcing it wider, kicking, pulling myself up. And then I was free. I exploded out of the earth, coughing, choking, dragging in huge, gasping breaths. My entire body trembled. I collapsed onto solid ground, the sun blinding, my lungs burning, my heart slamming against my ribs. I lay there for a long time, just breathing. Eventually, I pushed myself up. I was soaked, covered in mud, bleeding. My body ached, my hands torn, my legs shaking. But I was alive. The trail was visible in the distance. The other hikers were still there, dry and oblivious. None of them had seen what happened. None of them had any idea that I had just been buried in the river. I stood up, unsteady, and started walking. I had spent the day hiking through Sequoia National Park, winding my way along dirt trails that twisted through the towering trees. The air had that crisp mountain scent, pine needles, dry earth, and the faint dampness of old wood. I had come here alone, needing a break from the city, from the noise, from people. There was something peaceful about being surrounded by nothing but wilderness, just me and the land. As the sun dipped below the ridgeline, I parked my truck in a small pullout, far enough from the main roads that I wouldn't hear passing cars, but close enough that I could drive out in the morning without much trouble. The bed of my truck was set up perfectly for sleeping. An old sleeping bag, a foam pad, and a couple of extra blankets in case the mountain air turned colder than expected. I ate a quick meal, some jerky and trail mix, washed it down with water, and decided to climb up onto a nearby boulder to take in the night sky. The boulder was massive, smooth in some places, jagged in others. It must have been here for thousands of years, untouched by time except for the faint grooves and depressions carved into its surface. At first, I didn't pay much attention to them, just running my fingers over the shallow circular holes and long, thin crevices. But as I sat there, my mind started piecing things together. These weren't just marks left by wind and rain. These were mortar bowls, places where people long before me had ground acorns into meal, had worked their food with stone tools. The thin, worn-down channels had been used to sharpen knives, maybe spears. I imagined the people who once lived here, their fires glowing against the dark trunks of the sequoias, their voices carried by the wind. It felt strange, being in the same place they once stood, touching the same rock they had touched centuries ago. A feeling settled into my gut, not fear exactly, but something close. A kind of awareness, a quiet respect for whatever was left behind. The stars above were sharp and bright, undiluted by city lights. I stayed up there for a while, watching them, feeling the cold seep into my skin. Eventually, my tiredness won over, and I climbed back down to my truck. I crawled into my sleeping bag, zipped it up tight, and let the sounds of the forest lull me to sleep. At least, I thought I went to sleep. I woke up to silence. No wind through the trees, no chirping of crickets, no rustling of leaves. Just heavy, suffocating stillness. My body felt strange, weighted down in a way that didn't make sense. I tried to move, but I could barely shift. The fabric of my sleeping bag pressed against my skin, tight and unyielding. My breath came slow, thick, like I was swimming through a dream I couldn't wake up from. Then I realized I wasn't in my truck anymore. The metal walls were gone. The soft foam pad beneath me was gone. The smell of old upholstery, the faint scent of gas and dust, it was all gone. Instead, I was lying on the cold, hard ground, surrounded by trees. The realization hit me in waves. My breathing quickened. My hands clenched the sleeping bag, fingers pressing into the fabric. I turned my head slightly, trying to get a sense of where I was, but the darkness was nearly complete. Then I saw them. To my left, the ground moved. A thick, shifting mass of writhing bodies, slithering in complete silence. At first, my brain struggled to make sense of what I was looking at. The movement was unnatural, fluid, but not like water, like muscle, like skin on dirt. A sea of black, eel-like shapes undulating as one. Snakes, hundreds of them. They slid past me in a single column, each one disappearing into the shadows ahead. Their scales caught the faintest bits of moonlight, making their bodies gleam wetly. I could feel the cold sweat on my back now, pressing into the fabric of my sleeping bag. My arms and legs were rigid, locked in place. I wanted to move, to sit up, to run, to do anything, but I couldn't. Then, as if sensing my fear, something separated from the mass. A rattlesnake. Its head lifted slightly above the others, its body still half submerged in the writhing flow of blackness. The rattle at the end of its tail was silent, still. Its eyes locked onto me, unblinking, unfeeling. And then it struck. I kicked out instinctively, my foot jerking beneath the sleeping bag, but it was sluggish, like trying to move underwater. The snake's fangs hit fabric, catching for a moment before it pulled back. My breath came in shallow gasps. It recoiled, then struck again. Another kick, harder this time. The rattlesnake pulled away, retreating into the slithering blackness. I followed its path with my eyes, watching as it slid forward, disappearing into something I hadn't noticed before. Something that made my stomach clench with a kind of horror I hadn't felt before in my life. A carcass. No, not just any carcass. A horse. A massive black horse, its body stretched out on the forest floor. Its stomach had been split open, a deep, gaping wound that looked almost surgical, like something had cut it with precision. And the snakes, all of them, were crawling inside. The mass of writhing bodies slithered one after the other, disappearing into the hollowed-out cavity of the horse's belly, vanishing into the darkness within. The air around me was thick with the stench of something rotten, something long dead. It pressed into my lungs, making it hard to breathe. I couldn't look away. My head was resting against its side. I scrambled to move, my muscles finally breaking free from whatever had been holding them. I pushed myself away, rolling onto my hands and knees, my breathing coming in quick, panicked gulps. The cold earth beneath my fingers felt too real. The weight in my limbs felt too real. I turned, my eyes still locked on the black hole of the horse's stomach. The last of the snakes disappeared inside. Silence fell again. Then movement. A shift. A slow, wet shift. I didn't wait. I ran. I ran so hard I could feel my heart slamming against my ribs, my breath tearing through my throat. The trees blurred past me, the ground uneven and slick beneath my bare feet. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't care. Then, suddenly, I wasn't running anymore. I was sitting upright in my truck. The cold metal bed pressed against my back. My sleeping bag was wrapped tightly around me. My heart pounded in my ears, my breath still ragged. It took a moment to realize I was shaking, my body drenched in sweat despite the cool night air. I looked around. I was back. The trees stood still. The sky was clear. The world was normal again, but my hands wouldn't stop trembling. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Even now, I don't know what happened. I don't believe in ghosts or spirits, but that dream, if it was a dream, felt like something else. Something I can't explain. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe it was nothing, but I haven't been back to Sequoia since. I had just gotten off work when I saw the sky. It was a deep, bruised shade of purple, streaked with thick bands of smoke that caught the dying sunlight, turning it into something almost unnatural. Orange, gold, and a sickly kind of red stretched across the horizon. The air was different. It smelled sharp, heavy, like burning pine needles, and something else I couldn't place. My dad had also just gotten home. I told him we needed to leave. The fire had been creeping closer for days, but it wasn't until I saw the mountain glowing, until I could actually see it with my own eyes, that it felt real. At first, my parents weren't convinced. Maybe it was denial. Maybe they didn't want to believe our home, our land, our animals, everything was at risk. But when we stepped outside and looked toward the ridge, we saw the flames licking their way down the slope, faster than I ever would have thought possible. That was when the real panic set in. We had about 3 hours to pack, maybe less. The fire moved unpredictably, and even though emergency alerts had gone out to other areas, we were still in the watch and prepare phase. But I knew better. I felt it. That kind of fire doesn't just stop. The first thing I did was grab all our legal documents, birth certificates, medical files, passports. Things that couldn't be replaced. I wasn't thinking about sentimental value. I was thinking about survival. It took longer than I expected. Nearly half an hour of digging through drawers, checking folders, making sure I didn't forget anything. My hands were shaking. After that, I found my younger sister. She was only 8. I still remember the look on her face, how her lower lip wobbled as she clutched a stuffed animal to her chest. The idea of losing everything was too big for her to understand, but she knew enough to be terrified. I had to be the one to tell her she couldn't take all of her stuffed animals. That might have been the hardest moment of the entire night. She wanted to bring nothing but her stuffed animals, like if she could just hold on to them, everything would be okay. I tried to reason with her, but it was like trying to explain the ocean to someone who had never seen water. In the end, I had to do most of the packing for her. She finally settled on a few favorites and a little elephant plush that she'd gotten from an ambulance when she was 4. She clutched that elephant like it was the only thing keeping her together. My other sister was strangely calm. She packed what she needed in a single small bag, and that was it. No panic, no hesitation. I don't know if it was shock or just a different way of coping, but while the rest of us were scrambling, she was ready in minutes. My parents told me to go pack my own things. I didn't know what to take. There were things I wanted to save, things I had spent years collecting, but it all felt so meaningless in that moment. What good was a purse collection if the house was gone? What good was artwork if it turned to ash? I packed anyway. My most expensive stuff, my most important items, and then somewhere in the middle of it, I lost it. The heat, the stress, the sheer weight of what was happening, it all crashed down on me at once. I was on the top floor, where the summer heat turned everything into an oven, and I couldn't breathe. My head spun, my hands went numb, and I just sat there on the floor, trying to force air into my lungs. I don't know how long I stayed like that. Eventually, I pushed through it. I had to. There was no time to break down. After that, we focused on the animals. At the time, we had 12 hens, 2 guinea pigs, and 2 dogs. We packed food for everyone, bags of feed, hay, bedding, water bottles. The dogs were easy. The guinea pigs were harder. I put them in their transport cage and set them by the door. By then, the fire was already halfway down the mountain. My dad had borrowed a trailer from his boss. I wasn't allowed to help move anything outside. The smoke was getting thicker, and my asthma would have made it dangerous. So I stood by the door, pacing, checking and rechecking our supplies, feeling completely useless as I listened to my family rushing in and out. By the time we finished packing, it was night. The fire had reached the base of the mountain. I could hear it now, the deep roar of flames consuming trees, the crack and pop of burning branches. It didn't sound like a campfire. It sounded alive. I begged my parents to leave, but they said not yet. So we waited. I have no idea how I fell asleep that night, but somehow I did. My sisters and I slept next to the front door, as if being closer to the exit would somehow keep us safe. I don't know how to explain what I felt looking out at that fire. It was like being hypnotized. The way the flames flickered and stretched across the sky, the way the smoke curled up into the darkness, catching the moonlight, it was beautiful in the most horrifying way. I knew it was dangerous. I knew it was deadly, but I couldn't look away. At some point, exhaustion won out. I remember reading until my eyes wouldn't stay open. I woke up multiple times through the night, and each time, the flames were lower. Bit by bit, the fire was shrinking. By 6 a.m., the worst of it was over. The mountain was still burning, but the 1,000-foot flames were gone. I woke everyone up, shaking them, barely able to get words out. We stepped outside together, and for the first time in what felt like forever, we could breathe. We found out later that local firefighters had worked through the night to set up a fire line. That was what saved us. If they hadn't stopped it when they did, the fire would have torn through our town. No one died. A firefighter was badly burned, but he survived. A bucket helicopter crashed during the effort, but everyone made it out alive. One house was lost. Several government buildings burned. In total, 35,000 acres were destroyed. I thought the worst was over, but the losses kept coming. We had already lost a home to fire before. That kind of fear never really leaves you. Even after we knew we were safe, it still felt impossible to relax. The air smelled like smoke for weeks. The mountains didn't look the same. I didn't feel the same. And then the real grief started. Lady, my childhood dog, was already gone, but I still thought about her that night. I thought about what it would have been like if we hadn't made it, if we'd lost everything again. Thunder, my bird, died from a freak accident not long after. Rex, a fox I had cared for at the animal sanctuary, didn't make it. The stress, the heat, it was too much for him. The fire ended, but the losses never really stopped. Even now, I can still see it when I close my eyes. The mountain burning, the sky glowing, the way the flames seemed to move like something alive. It was the most horrific thing I have ever seen, and I will never forget it. I was 10 years old the day my world split in half. It had been an ordinary day, or at least it seemed that way at first. School was uneventful, and afterward, I went to my usual choir club. We were practicing for an upcoming performance, and I remember being focused on getting my part right, lost in the rhythm of the songs. It felt like every other afternoon I had spent in that stuffy little room, surrounded by the voices of other kids, the piano in the corner barely holding its tune, the scent of old wood and dust thick in the air. I had no idea what was coming. When practice ended, I expected to see my mom waiting outside like always. That was our routine. She always picked me up after choir, and then we would go home, maybe stopping for a snack or to pick up my little brother from his activities. That was how it always went. But that day, when I stepped outside, I saw my dad's car instead. It confused me. It wasn't that he never picked me up. He had before, but it was so rare that I hesitated for a moment before walking toward the car. The sun was setting, and the sky was painted in shades of deep orange and purple. A warm breeze stirred the air. It should have been a beautiful evening, but something about it felt off. I just didn't know why yet. I opened the car door and climbed in. My dad barely looked at me. His face was tense, his grip tight on the steering wheel. He was staring straight ahead, not saying a word. Normally, he would at least ask how my day had been, but there was nothing. Just silence. The engine hummed as we pulled out onto the road. I sat there, waiting for him to say something. The longer the silence stretched, the more uncomfortable I felt. We drove through town, past streets I had seen 100 times before. The houses and shops blurred together as I kept glancing at my dad, trying to figure out what was wrong. His knuckles were white on the wheel. His jaw was clenched so tight that I could see the muscles in his face twitching. Then, almost under his breath, he started mumbling. At first, I couldn't make out what he was saying. His voice was low, shaking, like he was talking to himself more than to me. But as the minutes passed, I caught pieces of it. "I'm sorry. So sorry. Never see me again." I didn't understand. Something cold settled in my stomach. "What?" I asked, my voice small. He didn't respond. I asked again, louder this time, but he wouldn't look at me, wouldn't answer. I wanted to go home. The drive felt like it was taking forever. The streets blurred past, the evening sky growing darker. I watched the streetlights flick on as we passed beneath them, their glow stretching across the windshield. My dad kept driving, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles looked like they might split through the skin. Something was very wrong. I kept asking what he meant, why he was saying those things, but he wouldn't tell me. He just kept driving, kept whispering under his breath. By the time we reached home, my heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The second he pulled into the driveway, I unbuckled my seatbelt, ready to get out, ready to run inside and find my mom. But my dad didn't move. He just sat there. "Get out," he said. I froze. The way he said it wasn't angry. It wasn't loud. It was quiet, flat, empty. Something about it scared me more than if he had shouted. I didn't move. Then he spoke again, his voice shaking. "You won't see me again. I'll be dead soon." I felt like I couldn't breathe. My hands fumbled for the door handle, but I couldn't make myself move. My dad had never spoken like this before. He had never acted like this before. I didn't know what to do. I didn't understand what was happening. Then he reached over and shoved the door open. "Go inside." I stumbled out of the car, my legs feeling unsteady beneath me. He slammed the door shut the moment I was out. For a second, I thought he was going to drive away, but he didn't. He just sat there. I turned and ran toward the house. The door was open. I hesitated, my stomach twisting. That wasn't right. My mom always locked the door when she was inside. I stepped forward. The porch creaked under my feet. Then I saw it. The puddle. Dark. Shiny. Spreading across the floor just inside the doorway. For a moment, my brain refused to register what I was looking at. My breath caught in my throat. The air felt thick, heavy. I felt like I was standing underwater. Then I saw the streaks on the floor, like something had been dragged. My stomach flipped. I took a step inside. The metallic scent filled my nose, thick and suffocating. The house was silent. No voices, no movement, just that awful, sticky red stain on the floor. Then I heard voices outside, shouting. I turned and ran back outside, my feet slamming against the ground. Police. They were already there. Flashing lights bouncing off the walls of the houses, the wail of sirens cutting through the night. People were standing outside, neighbors watching from their porches. I didn't understand what was happening. My chest felt tight, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Then I heard someone say my mom's name. She was alive. They told me she was at the hospital. I didn't understand. I didn't know why she was there, why there was blood in the house. The words felt distant, like I was hearing them from the other end of a tunnel. Then someone told me what happened. My dad had attacked her. He had found a pack of old condoms in the cupboard, and he had snapped. It didn't matter that they weren't hers. Didn't matter that they had probably been left there by the previous tenants before we moved in. Didn't matter that he controlled every part of her life, that he never let her go anywhere alone. None of that mattered. He convinced himself she had cheated, and that was all it took. He smashed a wine bottle over her head. He would have killed her if my little brother hadn't been there. 7 years old. Just a kid. But he had saved her life. I don't know how he did it. I don't know what he did, what he said, how he got my dad to stop. But he did. The police arrested my dad. He didn't even fight. Didn't resist. He was put in a mental ward. I never saw him again. But I still think about my brother. About what he saw. About how different things could have been if he hadn't been there. We both carry it with us. The scars are still there, even if they don't show. But somehow, despite everything, we turned out okay. And my mom is the strongest person I know. She never let that night define her. She never let it break her. She raised us on her own, with nothing but kindness and love, despite everything she had been through. She never let it turn her bitter. That kind of strength is something I'll never forget. And one day, I will tell my brother how grateful I am that he was there, because I don't think I ever really have. There wasn't much to do in our little town. On Friday nights, if you weren't at the football game, you were probably cruising the back roads or parked somewhere on the outskirts, looking up at the stars with your girl. That's what I was doing that night, driving out past the town limits, past where the streetlights stopped, into the open nothing of the Texas Panhandle. It was flat as a sheet of paper out there. No trees, no hills, no creeks or ponds. Just miles of dry grass stretching in every direction, split by long dirt roads cutting through the emptiness. You could see the horizon no matter where you stood. On clear nights, the stars were bright enough to cast shadows. It was quiet, too, the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. No buzzing cicadas, no rustling trees. Just the sound of the wind moving over the grass. I was driving with my girlfriend in my old pickup, looking for a good place to pull over. I wasn't thinking about much, just the usual teenage stuff. Finding a spot, parking, spending some time together. I took a random dirt road about 10 miles outside of town, slowing down as the dust kicked up behind us. There weren't any farms out this way, no fences or cattle guards, just open land. It felt like we were the only two people left in the world. After driving a little while, I pulled over onto the shoulder, killed the engine, and stepped out. My girlfriend followed. The air was warm, the kind of lingering heat that sticks around after a hot day, and the wind had a slow, steady push to it, rolling across the open land in heavy gusts. We stood a few feet from the truck, talking, looking up at the stars, letting the quiet settle around us. It was peaceful in a way that made me feel small, like we were standing on the edge of something enormous. I leaned in close, brushing her hair back, about to kiss her, when I heard it. A scream. Faint, far off, carried on the wind. It was high-pitched, sharp, and human. A woman's scream. I froze. My girlfriend didn't react. I looked at her. "Did you hear that?" She shook her head. I glanced back over the empty fields. My heart had started beating faster, but I told myself it was nothing. Maybe just my ears playing tricks on me. But then it came again, faint but clear, a long, distant wail that trailed off too quickly, like it had been cut short. I swallowed. The wind moved over the grass again. It had been quiet before, but now the silence felt deeper, heavier. I turned back to my girlfriend. She was smiling, shaking her head, telling me I was just trying to scare her. I wasn't. I held up a hand. "Stop talking for a second." She stopped. We stood there listening. Nothing. Then, 3 feet away, right next to us in the dark, we heard it. A cough. A deep, rough, unmistakably human cough. It came from the grass. Right there. I felt something in my stomach drop straight through me. Every hair on my body stood up. I turned my head slowly, my eyes trying to adjust to the darkness, but there was nothing. Just open grass, waving slightly in the wind. I hadn't heard anyone walk up, hadn't seen any movement, hadn't noticed anything at all. But someone was sitting out there, no more than an arm's length away from us, coughing. I felt my girlfriend grab my wrist. Her nails dug into my skin. I didn't move. I couldn't. I just stood there, my breathing shallow, my ears straining for any sign of movement. Nothing. Then another cough. Short, raspy, wet. It was coming from right there. I took a step back. My girlfriend pulled on my arm, whispering my name, her voice tight with panic. I took another step. The truck was only a few feet away, but it felt like a mile. My legs were stiff, my brain screaming at me to move, to run. But I didn't want to turn my back. Another cough. We turned and bolted for the truck. I yanked the door open, practically throwing my girlfriend inside. My hands were shaking so bad I fumbled with the keys, my fingers slipping as I tried to jam them into the ignition. The truck was old. Sometimes it took a second to turn over. I twisted the key. The engine whined. Another cough. The sound of it was closer now, like whoever it was had leaned forward. The cough was wheezy, deliberate, the kind that someone makes when they know you're listening. The engine roared to life. I slammed my foot down on the gas. The tires spit up dirt as we lurched forward, bouncing onto the road. My headlights swept over the grass, but there was nothing there. Just open land. We sped down the road, dust billowing behind us, my girlfriend curled up against the door, her arms wrapped around herself. I was gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles ached. Neither of us spoke. I don't remember how long we drove. I don't even remember getting back into town. All I know is that when we finally stopped, when I finally let go of the wheel, my hands were ice cold, my skin clammy. My girlfriend was shaking. We never talked about it after that. Not really. I never went back out there. I don't know who it was. I don't know how they got out there. And I don't know why they were sitting alone in the middle of the Texas Panhandle, in the dead of night, coughing. I grew up in a funeral home. That's the first thing people always get stuck on when I tell them about my childhood. They picture horror movies and ghosts, but it wasn't anything like that. It was quiet, somber. Death was a part of everyday life for my family. While other kids were going to soccer practice or working part-time jobs at fast food places, I was helping out in the office, handling paperwork, answering phones, and organizing flower arrangements for services. It wasn't weird to me. It was just life. That's why, when I was 15, I didn't think twice when my parents asked me to help with a particularly tragic case. A woman and her infant child had been murdered in their home, shot in cold blood. No apparent motive. There were very few clues. It made headlines across town. People whispered about it in grocery store lines, and my teachers at school kept bringing it up in hushed tones. The husband, a man named Robert, had been at work when it happened. He had come home to find his wife and child dead. The police were desperate for leads. The case was shocking, brutal. No forced entry, no obvious suspects, and no one in the neighborhood had seen or heard a thing. The funeral was massive. People from all over the city came to pay their respects. The husband was there, of course, his face hollowed out with grief. He barely spoke. He shook hands. He nodded when people offered condolences, but he didn't really say much. He looked lost, like a man who had no idea how to function anymore. I was asked to help out in a small but important way. The police wanted to keep track of the people who were sending flowers. Sometimes killers return to the scene, blend in, try to be part of the grieving process. Sometimes they slip up. So my job was simple. Take the cards from the flower arrangements, make copies, and bring them to the husband. If he recognized any names, he would let us know. Then I'd put the cards back. It made sense for me to do it. I was young, just a kid, and people didn't pay much attention to me. I was unobtrusive. No one would find it suspicious. I spent the entire day walking back and forth, gathering flower cards, quietly handing them to the police, then returning them to their spots. It felt routine. Sad, but routine. I talked to the husband quite a bit. Not long conversations, just small interactions. He was always polite, always quiet. He seemed destroyed by what had happened. His eyes were red-rimmed. His hands shook slightly when he took the papers from me. He thanked me every time. He was just a grieving man. That's all I saw. But the cops saw something else. I found out later that the police had a witness. Not someone they had told the press about. Not an adult who could be easily intimidated or bribed. The witness was a 3-year-old girl. She had been playing outside on the day of the murder. Too young to understand what she was seeing, but old enough to remember faces. She saw a man leaving the house. She told her parents about it later, and the police took her statement. She recognized him. It wasn't a stranger. It wasn't a masked intruder. It was the husband's best friend, the man who had been at the funeral, the man who had stood in the receiving line, shaking hands and accepting condolences as if he were grieving too. The man who had looked me in the eyes multiple times and never once seemed out of place. The police started digging deeper. What they found was worse than anyone expected. It wasn't just the friend. It was the husband too. They had made a pact. They planned to kill each other's families and then run off together with their secretaries. A cold, calculated plan. A plan that would have worked if not for a 3-year-old girl. I didn't see them get arrested. I only found out later, in pieces. My parents didn't tell me all at once. They fed me the details over time, probably thinking it would be easier to process that way. It wasn't. I still remember sitting at the kitchen table, hearing my dad say the words out loud. The husband did it. Or more accurately, he had planned it. He hadn't been the one to pull the trigger, but he had known. He had wanted it. He had stood there beside me, mourning, grieving, shaking, and the whole time, he had known exactly what had happened. It wasn't until the police confronted his friend that things started unraveling. One of them cracked. I don't know who. I don't know if it was the friend or the husband, but it didn't matter. They both went to jail. Multiple counts of murder. Life sentences. All because a 3-year-old girl had the courage to say what she saw. I think about it a lot. I think about how easy it is to be fooled. How a person can stand beside you, breathe the same air as you, and be hiding something monstrous. I wasn't naive before this happened. Growing up in a funeral home teaches you early on that people die, sometimes in ways that aren't fair. But this was different. This wasn't illness or an accident. This was something deliberate. This was a man who had watched me work, had looked at me with tired, grief-stricken eyes, and had never once let anything slip. I don't think I've ever looked at people the same way since then. I used to believe you could tell, that there would be something in the way a person carried themselves, some little sign that they were capable of something so terrible. But there isn't. Sometimes, monsters were the face of a grieving husband, and sometimes, the only person brave enough to stop them is a child. I don't remember why my parents chose to take us camping that weekend. We weren't a family that camped often. Maybe my mother thought it would be good for us, some kind of fresh start. Maybe my stepfather just wanted to be away from town, where no one could hear him yell. Whatever the reason, I remember the drive. I was 10 years old, sitting in the back seat of our little Honda Civic hatchback, my sister beside me. She was 12, and we didn't get along well, but on that night, we had no choice but to sit close. My mother sat in the front passenger seat, quiet and tense as she usually was when my stepfather had been drinking. He drove, gripping the wheel a little too hard, a beer can wedged between his legs. It was late, later than it should have been for setting up a campsite, and the deeper we drove into Mark Twain National Forest, the darker the world became around us. I remember watching out the window as the last slivers of sunlight faded behind the trees. The road was narrow and winding, the trees leaning in so close on both sides that it felt like we were driving into a tunnel. The headlights cast long shadows that shifted strangely with each turn, the forest growing darker, deeper, heavier. We weren't headed to a campground. My stepfather didn't believe in campgrounds, said they were for people who didn't know how to camp. Instead, he drove us down an unmarked dirt road, tires crunching over gravel, until finally, he pulled off into a clearing surrounded by trees. The moment we stepped out of the car, I knew we had made a mistake. The forest felt wrong. I can't explain it. It wasn't that there were strange noises or anything obviously out of place. It was more like an absence. No wind, no movement in the trees. Just a stillness that settled in my chest, an instinctual wrongness I was too young to put into words. But there was no arguing with my stepfather. We had arrived. We hurried to set up camp, knowing we didn't have much time before full darkness swallowed us. My mother and sister unpacked the sleeping bags while I fumbled with the tent poles, trying to be useful. My stepfather, already drunk, was barking orders and swearing under his breath. Then we realized we had forgotten the lantern. By the time we got the tent standing, night had fully set in. It was black, a kind of darkness I had never experienced before. The kind of darkness where the trees disappeared completely, where the sky seemed too far away, and where the ground felt like it might drop away at any moment. There was no fire. My stepfather, in one of his moods, refused to let us start one. He didn't want to be bothered. Instead, we climbed into the tent, all 4 of us pressed together in the small space. The only light came from the dim glow of my mother's watch face, which she kept close, as if time itself might protect us. Then we heard the footsteps. At first, they were distant, barely more than a whisper through the dry leaves. A soft rustling, steady, deliberate. Not the erratic movements of an animal, but the slow, careful steps of something moving through the trees. I held my breath, listening. The sound came closer. It wasn't loud, but it was constant, growing more distinct with every passing second. Leaves shifting, twigs snapping underfoot. A slow, measured pace, as if whoever was out there knew exactly where they were going. I wanted to believe it was nothing. Maybe a deer, maybe a raccoon. But deer don't move like that. Raccoons don't walk with such careful, steady steps. And whoever was out there didn't have a light. I lay frozen in my sleeping bag, heart hammering so hard I thought it might be loud enough for the thing outside to hear. My mother was perfectly still beside me. My sister, too. Even my stepfather had gone silent. We waited. The steps came closer. Then, a twig snapped, loud and sharp, just outside the tent. Before I could even process what was happening, my stepfather let out a scream. Not a yell of anger, not a drunken outburst. A scream. A raw, panicked, animal sound. The kind I had never heard come from him before. My mother shrieked, and then we were moving. We tore out of that tent like our lives depended on it. My stepfather was in front, for once not slowing down to curse at us. My mother was right behind him, my sister and I scrambling after them. I could barely see where I was going, my feet catching on roots and rocks, branches scratching at my arms as we ran blindly through the darkness. The car. That was the only thought in my mind. Get to the car. The footsteps behind us had stopped, but I didn't dare look back. My chest burned. My legs felt weak, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. We reached the car, my stepfather fumbling with the keys, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped them. My mother yanked the door open, shoving me and my sister inside before climbing in herself. The engine roared to life. Gravel spun under the tires as we lurched forward, headlights slicing through the blackness, illuminating the trees for only a second before we sped past them. My mother was crying. My sister was gripping my arm, so tightly it hurt. My stepfather said nothing, just drove, too fast, the car bouncing over the rough road as we fled. We didn't stop. Not until we were miles away, back on the main road, the forest far behind us. Only then did my stepfather finally pull over, hands still shaking as he lit a cigarette. No one spoke. We never went back for our things. The tent, the sleeping bags, everything, we left it all behind. It wasn't worth it. We never talked about that night. Not really. My stepfather never admitted that he had been scared. My mother never brought it up. My sister and I avoided it, though we both knew we had heard the same thing. I never camped again. I still dream about it, though. Even now, decades later, I find myself back in that tent, lying in the dark, waiting, and every time, I hear those footsteps. Slow, steady, coming closer. Golden Ears Park was supposed to be quiet that weekend. That was part of the reason we chose it. My girlfriend, a friend of ours, and I had planned the trip, looking forward to some peace away from the city. No loud families, no rowdy kids, no drunken groups keeping everyone awake. Just us, the trees, and the open air. When we arrived, the emptiness of the campground was obvious. There was only one other occupied campsite. Other than that, the place felt abandoned. Not run down, just eerily empty. The ranger station at the entrance had been unmanned when we arrived, so we grabbed a map from the box outside and found our spot. The first day, we set up camp, gathered firewood, and explored. The air smelled like pine needles and damp earth, fresh from a recent rain. The towering trees made everything feel secluded, like we had stepped into a different world. It was during that first walk that we saw it. A picture-perfect campsite, the kind you'd see in an outdoor gear catalog. A large tent, chairs neatly arranged around a fire pit, coolers stacked beside them. It was too perfect, too clean, like someone had set it up for a staged photo and then disappeared. We figured the campers had gone out for supplies. Maybe they were hiking. We didn't think much of it. But by the second day, something started to feel wrong. The campsite remained untouched. No sounds of people, no movement. The fire pit was clean, untouched by ash. The tent never unzipped. The chairs never shifted. We never saw anyone come or go. By the third day, curiosity got the better of us. My girlfriend and our friend decided to take a closer look. From a distance, it still looked perfect. The fabric was bright, the poles stood firm, everything was exactly as it had been the first day. But as they got closer, something changed. The smell hit first. Urine, mold, something sickly sweet, like rotting fruit. It clung to the damp air, making their stomachs turn. They called me over. I walked up to find them standing a few feet from the entrance, staring. "Jesus Christ," I muttered, covering my nose. The tent had seemed pristine, but now, up close, we saw the dark patches of mold creeping along the seams. The rainfly sagged slightly, as if it had absorbed moisture and never dried. One of them gave the tent a small shake. No response. Another shake. Silence. Then, cautiously, they unzipped the flap. The smell inside was worse. Empty cat food tins were scattered across the floor. Blankets, damp and covered in mildew, were piled haphazardly. But the real shock was what was inside the tent. Duffel bags. Several of them, stuffed full. At first, it was just clothes. *** brand name clothing ***, expensive shoes. Things you wouldn't expect to see dumped in a tent in the middle of nowhere. Then came the stranger items. *** makeup, broken mirrors, wine bottles, batteries, cigarettes ***. A cell phone lay among the mess. Its screen, when lit, was filled with Japanese text. And then the journal. It was small, leather-bound, and worn at the edges. The handwriting inside was neat, slanted, written by someone who took their time with each letter. The first few pages were normal. A girl writing about her trip, her boyfriend, their struggles. She wrote about how she loved him, how sex with him was amazing, how she never wanted him to leave, even though, in her own words, she had *** so many men after her ***. Then the tone shifted. She wrote about fights, being evicted, how this trip was supposed to fix things. The last page stood out. A fight, a bad one. He said he was done, that I'd get what I deserved. Then, beneath that, an entire page of names and phone numbers. No context, no explanation. The date of the final entry? One day before we arrived. We backed out of the tent and took another look around. The coolers, when we finally opened them, were full of rotten food. The stench poured out as soon as the lids cracked open. And then the tools. Scattered among the belongings were rusty knives, cracked pipes, empty lighters. Nothing made sense. Whoever had been here had planned to stay a long time. The site had been paid for an entire week beyond when we had arrived. But they were gone. And yet, they hadn't packed. They had left everything. We debated what to do. We could have told a ranger, but with no one at the station, we didn't know where to report it. Besides, there was no sign of a crime. Just an abandoned camp. We talked about moving sites, but the place was nearly empty. Moving wouldn't change the unease settling in our guts. So we stayed. For the rest of the trip, the tent remained untouched. It sat there, watching us, a silent reminder that something had happened. At night, I kept waking up, listening. Every crack of a branch, every rustle in the leaves, my mind convinced itself that someone was coming back. But no one did. By the time we packed up to leave, nothing had changed. The tent was still there. The mold, the food, the cat tins, the duffel bags, everything exactly as it had been when we first found it. And as we drove out of the park, I found myself glancing back through the trees, expecting, ***, hoping ***, to see some movement. I never did. What happened at campsite 37? We don't know. We never found out who the girl was, or if she was okay. We don't know what happened after that last fight she wrote about. We don't know where they went, why they left everything behind, or why their entire lives were stuffed into a tent in the middle of the woods. We only know one thing. No one ever came back. I don't know why I agreed to go on that hike. Maybe it was boredom. Maybe it was the itch to do something different, to escape the day-to-day routine of life for a while. Or maybe it was just one of those things where you don't think much about it, and then suddenly you're deep in the woods with someone you barely know, wondering if you've made a mistake. I knew the guy, but I wouldn't call us close friends. More like an acquaintance. We'd met through mutual friends, hung out a couple of times, and somehow ended up planning this hike together. I didn't have anything against him, but I also didn't know much about him. Just that he liked being outdoors, and talked about hiking like it was second nature to him. The plan was simple. A couple of days in the wilds of West Virginia, away from the noise of civilization. Just two people, a pair of backpacks, and miles of untouched forest stretching in every direction. It was supposed to be peaceful, maybe even refreshing, but things don't always go the way you expect. We started early in the morning, parking his truck on the side of a narrow dirt road that wound up into the mountains. From there, we walked. The trail was rough but manageable, mostly packed dirt with sections of loose rock that made footing tricky. The trees were dense, thick trunks stretching high above us, their leaves filtering the sunlight into shifting patches of gold and green. The deeper we went, the quieter it got. The sound of the truck's engine faded into nothing, replaced by the rustling of leaves and the occasional call of a bird. I liked that part, the silence. It felt like stepping into a different world, where nothing existed but the forest and the path ahead. We hiked for hours, taking our time, stopping now and then to catch our breath or sip from our water bottles. He seemed completely at home in the woods, moving with a kind of ease that I didn't have. I'd hiked before, but not like this. Not this deep into nowhere, where there were no trail markers, no signs, no indication that anyone had ever been here before us. Somewhere around midday, we stopped near a small creek. The water was clear, cold, running smoothly over rocks and fallen branches. It seemed like a good place to rest, so we dropped our packs and sat down. That's when he pulled out the bag of Cheerios. At first, I didn't think much of it, just a snack. But then I watched as he did something that made me stop mid-drink and stare. He reached into his pack and pulled out a bowl. Not a camping mess kit, not a collapsible silicone bowl, just a regular plastic kitchen bowl. Then he scooped up some of the creek water, poured a handful of Cheerios onto the surface, and topped it off with powdered milk. And then he started eating. He didn't stir it. He didn't mix the powdered milk into the water. He just scooped up the floating cereal with his spoon, shoveling it into his mouth like this was the most normal thing in the world. I sat there watching, half expecting him to realize how bizarre it was. But he just kept going, chewing like he was completely unfazed. I had seen him eat cereal before. He'd always done it the normal way. Milk first, cereal on top, maybe a quick stir. But this was something else. I asked why he was doing it like that. I don't remember what he said. Something about how it still worked the same way, how it all ended up mixing in his stomach anyway. I guess it made some kind of weird sense, but it didn't sit right with me. Not just the way he ate it, but the way he didn't seem to notice how strange it was, like it was completely normal for him. We didn't talk much after that. I finished my food in silence, trying to shake the weird feeling the whole thing gave me. It wasn't just the cereal. It was him. Something about him fell off after that. We packed up and kept moving. The trail got rougher, climbing steadily upward. The air grew cooler, the trees taller. The deeper we went, the less it felt like we belonged there. The unease didn't fade. If anything, it got worse. He started acting different. Nothing obvious, just small things. He walked a little ahead of me, setting the pace without saying a word. When we stopped for water, he'd watch me drink, his eyes a little too focused. When I spoke, he took a little too long to respond, like he had to think about what to say. I told myself I was overthinking it, that I was just letting the weird cereal thing get to me. But the feeling didn't go away. By the time the sun started dipping toward the horizon, I realized we hadn't seen any signs of other people all day. No footprints, no distant voices, no old fire pits or makeshift campsites. Just endless forest, stretching on in every direction. We found a flat area near a ridge and set up camp. The ground was soft with pine needles, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and wood. We built a fire, ate dinner, and sat in silence as the last light faded from the sky. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. The fire was just embers, barely glowing. The forest was pitch black, the kind of darkness that swallows everything whole. And I heard something. Breathing. Not mine. Not his. Something else. Slow. Heavy. Close. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Just lay there, listening. The sound shifted. Something was moving outside the tent, just beyond the dying firelight. The breathing grew fainter, but the movement didn't stop. It was circling. I wanted to wake him up, but something told me not to. Then I heard the zipper. Not mine. His. Slow, careful. I held my breath. The tent shifted. He was getting out. I heard him stand. Heard his footsteps move away, slow and deliberate. Then silence. I don't know how long I lay there, heart pounding, straining to hear something, anything. But the forest had gone dead quiet. Eventually, I sat up. Listened. Still nothing. I unzipped my tent as quietly as I could and peeked out. The fire had burned down to a few glowing embers. The trees stood like black shadows against the faint light of the stars. And he was gone. His tent was still there. His backpack, his boots, everything. But he was nowhere in sight. I sat there for a long time, waiting, staring into the darkness. He never came back. When the first light of dawn touched the treetops, I packed my things and left. I didn't touch his stuff, didn't look back, just walked. I hiked for hours, my mind racing, my body running on pure adrenaline. When I finally reached the road, I found his truck still parked where we left it. I got in my car and drove. I don't know what happened to him. I never saw him again. I never told anyone. But I think about that night sometimes. About the way he ate those Cheerios. About the way he acted afterward. About the breathing outside the tent. And about the fact that, when I left, his boots were still sitting by his tent. And the ground around them was undisturbed.